Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is no gods, no masters in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 31, Triad. Mako sat up when he awoke, purely out of habit, and struck his head on the top of the airship's cabin, just as he had every morning since their departure. He groaned and rubbed the same spot on his forehead, imagining that it would only take a few more days until he had a permanent red blotch there. With a yawn, he shuffled over to the ladder and climbed down, grabbing a fresh set of clothes from the laundry Korra had done the night before when a gust of wind hit the ship and rocked them. They were already in the air, then. He looked around and saw Asami at the helm and Kuvira reading on one of the benches, while a wave of heat hit him from behind. The unpleasant smell of burning food came with it, and Korra was there when he turned around, still in panties and an undershirt, holding a flame much too close to the bottom of a pot of miso soup. "What are you doing?" "Heating up breakfast. What's it look like I'm doing?" "It sure smells like you're charring it. Give it here," he said, taking the pot by the handle. Korra huffed and glared at him, but Mako only took a ladle and sampled a spoonful. "We can still salvage it." "You added something, though." "I threw in a couple of those." Korra pointed to a small bottle of crushed brown and green pericarps. "They smelled good." "The peppercorns." "Okay, that'll complement the lemon in the broth. Adds a little bite." He ignited a small flame in his palm and held it at a more appropriate length from the bottom of the pot, moving in slow circles while the broth simmered. "See? Back and forth, low heat. It doesn't have to get really bubbly. You try." He took her hand and slipped the fire over to her. Mako lightly gripped her wrist and guided her through the same motions, running his thumb along the heel of her palm as he did. He thought there would be more calluses to match the old scars that lined her left arm, but her skin there was surprisingly smooth and warm. "And that should do it. Stir in a little bit of salt and coriander, and you're done," Mako said, handing the pot back to her. She took it with a shaky hand, and he saw that she was breathing heavily and trying very hard not to show it. Definitely a turn on, he thought while suppressing a smirk. "I'm going to shower. Is the tank full?" "Yeah, I boiled most of the salt out of it," she mumbled, setting the pot back on the stovetop. Mako put his fresh clothes on the shelf, pulled back the curtain that afforded the barest shred of privacy, and stripped down before transferring some heat to the tank above him. Once his fingers stung from the warmth, he opened the faucet and let the water beat down on his head and shoulders. It was far from the lap of luxury, but still impressive, given the short time Asami's team had been given to make the airship habitable. He worked quickly, letting the water soak him and then stopping the flow to apply soap and shampoo. An uncomfortable chill settled around him without the water, and he only slowed down when he cleaned the remnants of the wolf bite on his arm and a particularly deep bite Marxa had left on his shoulder the night before they departed. The water flowed again for a few brief moments to wash everything away, and then he was toweling off, knocking over one of Asami's bottles of nice shampoo in the process. A small, petty part of him was glad they never ended up moving in together. He reached around the curtain and grabbed his fresh clothes, trying his best not to knock against the walls of the cramped shower as he dressed. When he stepped out, he saw the others at the table, finishing off the remains of the miso soup he had made the night before. No one was retching or complaining, which was success enough for him. He emptied the last bit in the pot into his bowl and took the empty seat next to Asami. "What did you put in this?" she asked between mouthfuls. "It's really good." "Not me, the peppercorns were all Korra. I only kept her from burning it all to hell." "Oh," Asami and Kuvira said together, looking down at their soup. Korra shrank in her seat, and Kuvira tapped the side of her bowl. "That's what that was. I always wondered why the leftovers tasted so different. Gazan was the cook, not me." "Wait, she's been burning everything before I wake up. How come you didn't say anything?" "She's right here," Korra said indignantly. Kuvira shrugged. "It didn't taste as bad as army rations. Besides, we don't really talk, actually. And I didn't want to complain about the cooking when you've been doing all of it this week." Mako took a sip of his miso soup and thought about that. She was right, they were certainly polite enough to one another, but Korra had been mediating all of their communication beyond good morning and good night. He knew she didn't want any mention of Su to come up, even if she didn't quite grasp what Mako had told her. That's true, you were hanging out with Korra and Zaofu and we split up after that. Huh. Guess I don't have much practice talking to queens. Well, great eyebrows, he said, racking his brain for something to say. Kuvira smiled and set her spoon in her bowl. Thanks. You too. An unpleasant bout of remembrance hit Mako as he looked at the unoccupied helm. Asami. Yes. Who's flying the ship? Autopilot, she said, nodding to the controls. Oh. Fancy. We didn't have that on the way back to Republic City, so just let it drift one morning. He caught a fearsome look from Korra that went unnoticed by Kuvira, who seemed rather interested once he mentioned her mother. There was no good way to finish that sentence truthfully. Let it drift one morning while she felt me up in the infirmary, and so he had to stumble through a recovery. But we didn't crash or hit anything, so, you know. No harm done. Asami stirred her tea. Scintillating. Look, with all the cooking, which is fine by the way, don't stop doing that. We're going to have to take on supplies soon. She took a map of the Fire Nation from her bag and spread it across the table while Korra, Kuvira, and Mako scrambled to get their breakfasts out of the way. Asami pointed to a stretch of water slightly northwest of Huanhe Island. This is about where we are. If we dip south, there's a town on the coast here where we can stock up. The name's right in the crease though, I can't read it. Chsaife, Mako said. That's Chsaife. About 2,000 people. Most people either go out on the fishing boats or work for one of the mining companies farther inland. Spicy carp trout's a local specialty, along with some kind of fiery sake. They all looked blankly at him. He shrugged. It's where my mom grew up. She used to tell me and Bolin about it when she couldn't think of a bedtime story. We always wanted to go and find the other side of our family like we did in Ba Sing Se, never got the chance. He paused for a moment to sigh deeply. Plus we can hug the northern coasts of the archipelago from there almost all the way to Kasai, Mako said. Korra drummed her fingers on the map, skirting toward Asami's before retreating and falling to her side next to Kuvira. All right. This isn't a field trip, though. We need to get to the capital as soon as we can, not go and sample the sake. In and out, no family reunions, no sake, I get it. I know what kind of messes you three get into when you're drunk, anyway. That earned him 3 withering glares, and he put his hands up in a conciliatory gesture before taking all the empty bowls to the sink. If Korra was going to throw jabs, she had to expect him to come back with a few of his own. He never figured the Avatar for someone who could dish it out but couldn't take it. He took a magazine he had read through 6 times out onto the catwalk that encircled the cabin. Wind hit him as soon as he stepped outside, cold and bracing, but he worked his way to the calmer aft of the walkway, where he had struck upon a pleasant little alcove with a protrusion at exactly the right height for sitting. He tried very hard not to think about the fact that he was sitting on the airship's septic tank. Halfway through an article he had read so many times he was beginning to see it in his sleep, the door to the cabin slammed shut. Oh, here we go. That was out of line, Asami said, shimmying her way along the precariously narrow catwalk to where he sat. If I had enough room right now I would slap you silly. Mako stood up and crossed his arms. Good thing for me you're left-handed, then. She was still decent with her right hand, Mako discovered as it sang across his cheek. Okay, should have seen that coming. You always knew just how to get the filling there, damn. I told you that in confidence, Asami said through a hiss. At worst I thought you'd use it to whack off a few times, not go and blab it back to them. Oh, I'm going to do that too, haven't had the chance yet. He was still slightly sore from so working him over, if he was being perfectly honest. There's not a ton of privacy on this airship, so I'm saving that for a rainy day. Not often I get to hear about you and the Avatar and the Earth Queen. Mako saw her winding back for another slap, but ducked in time and she struck her palm on the fuselage instead of him. You're an arrogant, egotistical prick, you know that. That stung, more than he would even admit to himself, but he wasn't about to let her see that. If she wanted to play that game, he could play. Then don't feed my ego, let's talk about you instead. You have no idea how to handle stress in a relationship. You push people away when you need them the most. You can be completely thoughtless to others when you get on a tear about something, he said, rattling them off as casually as if he were commenting on the weather. Asami bit her lip and ruined her lipstick while tears threatened to stain the face she was trying to keep straight. She lost control of a pained gasp, and Mako crumbled first as he always did, running his hand through his hair with a sigh. Look, that wasn't fair. I'm sorry. For the way I said it, not what I said. My delivery might need work, but you can't stand there and tell me I'm wrong. She trembled through a breath and wiped her eyes, leaving streaks of mascara trailing behind her fingers. Mako had no idea why she insisted on so much makeup while they were in the air. Kuvira hadn't bothered and Korra never used any, but he decided not to pick at it. I know, okay? I know. I won't let people be there for me and I cut and run when I'm stressed. I know. I did it with you, with John, you again, with Korra and the rest. Mako furrowed his brow. We were never together a second time. Not in a relationship, anyway. That summer in Heian. Oh, right. How did I forget that? Anyway. I don't exactly have a spate of successful relationships myself, so at least you're in good company, he said, moving to let her sit in the little alcove. Mako leaned on the railing and turned away from the wind. What about Mei? Tried to arrest me. Our relationship soured after that. Shiori. He shuddered. Trust me, you don't want to know. Asami shrugged before a smirk crept over her lips. Not even those twins from the Northern Water Tribe? Duh. Mako cut her off by frantically waving his hands. First of all, that was not a relationship. That was a long weekend. A very long, very drunk weekend. Second of all, don't mention that around Korra. So now you know I'm not great at this stuff, either. We might be the only people who can stand being in a relationship with each other. They both thought about it for a moment, then shook their heads. Everything really did go wrong with Korra, though, Asami said, absently flipping through Mako's magazine. I mean, I really care about her. I screwed up, though, and now, I just want her to be happy. She deserves that much. He wasn't quite sure who she was trying to convince, but an ominous grinding from the engine kept him from pressing the matter. Is it supposed to make that noise? Asami's eyes widened and she scrambled past him, clambering along the walkway and back into the cabin. He followed her, although the smoke billowing out along the airship's frame didn't inspire a great deal of optimism. Below them, the northern coast of Huanhe Island stretched out against a bright blue sea, and Mako wondered if he was too high up to break his fall with some concentrated firebending. So, are we falling out of the sky? He asked, stepping back into the cabin while Asami worked frantically at the controls. Because I'm not much of a go down with the ship type. Korra punched him. That's for the cute little comment before. We need to land, Asami said, yanking a lever. Now. They came in much faster than they should have, grinding to a shuddering halt as the anchoring tethers shot out. By the time they reeled the ship to the ground, there was so much smoke that they couldn't see out of the cabin. Asami hit the emergency stop rather than power down normally, and all the rotors and instrumentation around them simply died. When everything was silent and still, she sighed in relief and wiped a line of sweat from her neck. Without an exhaust fan to cycle the air, the cabin grew very stale, very fast, leaving everyone outside on an empty stretch of beach while Asami tinkered with the engine. Korra was making a good attempt at sand bending while Mako and Kuvira sat near the edge of the water, until Asami pulled out the remains of a tiny bulb in a metal cylinder. Piece of junk, Asami said, holding out the bulb before putting it into her pocket. What happened? Korra asked. Some of the coolant denatured and cracked a spark plug. Ended up snapping a condenser ring and frying this actuator's control circuit, too. We've been working the engine too hard, it's not meant to fly more than 12 hours at a time. Mako and Kuvira joined them at the engine access while Asami fished out of the pieces of the ruined condenser ring. Something you can fix? Kuvira asked. We have spare coolant, spark plugs and condenser rings, but not actuators. She held up the small cylinder and spun the arm on one end of it with her finger. I had to cut back on a lot of storage to make the ship habitable and still airworthy. See the connectors here? Totally cooked. Won't conduct electricity. So let's look at one that didn't get ruined and bend a replacement together, Cora said, reaching into the engine before Asami slapped her on the wrist. What? It's a platinum alloy, so unless you learned how to bend that we need to find another one. Might have to get it machined. This place didn't look like a big airship station from the sky. Cora looked at Mako. This still isn't a field trip. You say that like I sabotaged the thing. Letting off steam or not, she was beginning to wear on him. Mako hung back from all three of them while they walked to Gsaife, passing little fishing supply stores that dotted the walkways from the beach. The town proper was quiet, almost unnaturally so, and he saw precious few people out on the streets for a pleasant weekend. A few men hanging around on the other side of the street were the only group of people he saw, making comments to a passing woman and pulling water from a storm drain to snap at her ankles. A waterbender? He didn't have time to take a closer look before they found a metal shop. Asami went inside while they waited on the corner, where Mako had an unobstructed view of each cross street. They were all sparsely populated, if he was being very generous. It's way too empty here, he said, shifting back and forth on his heels. His hackles rose, as if he were being watched. This place isn't giving either of you a bad vibe. Fewer people to recognize us, Kuvira said. That seemed easily accomplished with a change of clothes and hairstyle, but he wasn't interested in antagonizing them further. Asami came out of the shop soon afterward, muttering and turning the broken actuator in her hand. I left the blueprint with them, it'll be ready in the morning, she said. Or it had better be. I paid up front. Cora rubbed her unscarred temple. So we're stuck here. Unless you want to charter a boat, but that would mean leaving our airship on the beach. Right now it's an 18 million yuan paperweight. Flying without the main rotor group working properly is just asking for the whole thing to blow up in the air. Mako actually felt his breath catch in his throat at the sheer cost of the ship, but Cora only sighed and shook her head. We'll wait for the part. This still isn't a chance to go and find your family, Mako. As opposed to everything else there is to do around here. We might as well get some lunch and look for a place to stay, then. That tatam is wreaking havoc on my back. There was a small restaurant on the next block that seemed quiet enough, and Cora relented when her stomach began to growl. What little miso soup had been left over wasn't enough to keep them going for the rest of the day. A cook and waitress were inside along with a few diners, but still nowhere near the amount Mako would expect for a town of Gsifei's size on a weekend afternoon. What can I get you? The waitress asked when they sat down in a back corner booth. She had bright amber eyes and slight singe marks on her fingertips, a firebender, Mako thought. Well, now that I've heard about it, some kind of spicy carp trout, Cora said, looking out the window every so often. The menu turned out to be rather insubstantial beyond that, and they all ordered the same thing. Do you have a phone here? Mako asked, ignoring Cora pursing her lips. Through there by the restrooms. He felt Cora's glare burning a hole in the back of his head until he ducked into the phone booth and dropped a good deal of money into the coin slot. What's the calling code for the United Republic? 3. Eventually he got through, receiving a low grumble for a response. Hey, it's me. Do you have to keep interrupting my mornings? Bolin asked, bed springs creaking in the background. Mako looked at the clock on the wall. It's past noon there. I like to sleep in on the weekends. What do you want? Did the Avatar try to kill you again? Only with looks. Listen, I need that address we got for Mom's family. Quickly would be ideal, this call is getting very expensive, he said, putting more coins in the phone. What, in Gsaife? Why? Can you just help me out, please? Okay. Hold on. Bolin set the phone down to go find the information, and all the while Mako was feeding coins into the phone until his pocket was considerably lighter. Alright, I got it. Number 98, Haifan Avenue. Nearest cross street is Taba. Thanks. Hey, don't send any more relatives, I can't pay another mortgage. He dropped the phone onto its hook an instant before it demanded more money. Mako repeated the address to himself a few times, trying to commit it to memory before another one of Cora's smart remarks distracted him. Their waitress brought glasses of water to their table in his absence, and Cora absently worked hers into a spiral before letting it drip back down into the glass. Waterbenders. Their meals came before he could think much more about the men on the street. 4 plates of well-seared carp trout arrived, bathed in a medley of spices to draw out as much natural acerbity as possible. Cora and Kuvira tucked in, while Asami cut up her helping first and Mako prepared his glass of water. It didn't help so much, he discovered. The flavor and heat exploded on his tongue, covering his whole mouth in a fire that the water did nothing to extinguish. He swallowed out of instinct, burning his throat and sending him into a fit of coughs. I thought you, out of all of us, would have been able to handle this, Cora said through a full mouth. All Mako could do was wheeze in between mouthfuls of water, which provided only fleeting relief before the sharp, pungent burn resurfaced. They drowned this in peppers. Once he recovered, Mako carefully scraped off most of the seasoning that was, in his opinion, far too liberally applied. After that it was much more manageable, although he still kept his water at the ready. Cora. No, Mako. You don't even know what I was going to ask, he said, his throat still burning. But I know my answer will be no, so it doesn't really matter, does it? We don't have time to look for your family. If we survive this, after we find Zahir and Pili, you can have the airship to hunt down as many relatives as you want. But not now, she said flatly, scowling down at her empty plate. Well, Mako thought, someone was testy. He had a sneaking suspicion about why that was and why all the chocolate in the airship was missing, but he knew better than to try and confirm it. It would only be a few more days at the worst, he told himself. So he hoped. Whatever you say, Water Tribe. The little bell over the front door rang, and Mako saw the 3 men from the street saunter in. One of them leaned against the front door to bar it, one took stock of all the diners, and the third went to the waitress at the register. He knew what was about to happen, if only because it had been his job, years ago. Can I at least take care of this mess? He asked, not entirely sure why he made the request. Professional disdain, perhaps. It all seemed so slipshod. Cora glanced over her shoulder at the entrance and shifted protectively toward Kuvira. Righting wrongs, protecting people, restoring balance, isn't this in your job description? We don't have time to get mixed up in this, she began, but Mako was already up and moving when a gap in the surveillance presented itself. He took the long way around the dining area, laid out in such a way that a dessert display obstructed their view of his approach. The register rang as it opened, and he stepped into view, hands held casually in his pockets. You want something? The man at the door asked, taking a step toward him. Maybe to know how you get away with doing such an awful job. Mako nodded to the man at the register. I've seen 12-year-olds pull off better shakedowns than this. He didn't feel the need to mention that he was the 12-year-old. The waitress glowered at him out of the corner of her eye, shaking her head as frantically and as subtly as she could, when the man at the register advanced on him. He drew a tendril of water from the skin on his hip. You some kind of hero or something? I don't think I've ever been mistaken for one of those. There was very little open space in the front of the restaurant. Fire bending would probably cause too much damage, to say nothing of lightning bending. He could try chi blocking, but he had only learned the most basic forms from Asami, and in a decidedly less combative context at that. Plain old fighting, then. He could do that. Mako saw the man's wrist flick, and he felt something pop in his neck as he moved his head to the side to dodge the shot. He had gone up against too many waterbenders to have a sucker punch get him. The water didn't have enough time to come back around before he dropped his stance and drove the heel of his palm hard into the man's water chakra. He gasped wordlessly and staggered back, falling to the floor with a thud. The remaining 2 men looked at their colleague, wheezing as pain diffused up through his abdomen, and then advanced on Mako. Plates and glasses clattered as the waitress ducked beneath the front counter. He pressed his advantage, grabbing one man's outstretched arm and pinning it against his side while sending his knee into the man's ribs. A fist landed in Mako's gut, and he could see the man wind back again while the telltale sound of swirling liquid told him what would happen next. Water froze into a blade around the man's hand, and Mako had to jump back to miss the swing. A button came neatly off his jacket, and the fabric around it tore in a clean horizontal line. He leapt back from 2 more swings, then sidestepped a jab before grabbing the ice and running the man into the back of a booth. His head bounced off the metal frame, and all he could do was lie on the ground, dazed, while Mako stomped the ice to shatter it. He grabbed him by the collar and tossed him into the first man before either of them could sit up. Mako picked up his jacket button and put it in his pocket before turning to the last man, who happened to be the largest. He looked to be re-examining their previous choice to pick a fight, and started backing up toward the door. That was fine with him. "You don't seem quite so dumb," Mako said, letting sparks swirl around his fingers. "Cut your losses. Take your guys and don't come back." His suggestion seemed to land. Mako stood back while he gathered up his colleagues, hoisting one onto each shoulder before taking his leave. Once they were well onto the next block, Mako turned back to the counter. Korra, Kuvira, and Asami came up from the back of the room while the other diners scrambled to leave. "They're gone. Thanks for the backup, by the way. We didn't have time to do anything, it was over in 30 seconds, Asami said. The waitress came right over the counter and started hitting Mako. "What the hell's the matter with you?" "Ah. Hey." Mako ducked around her fists, glaring at a very amused Asami. He didn't have any particular compunctions against hitting women, but she wasn't doing a great deal of damage. "Is this how they say thank you in the Fire Nation? All I had to do was pay them for the week and that would have been it," she said, putting her hair back in the top knot that had come loose in all the excitement. "Now I'm going to have 10 blazing monsoons in here tomorrow wrecking up the place." Blazing monsoons. What a stupid name. "Look, I know people like this, they don't keep at it if you don't make it worth their time. They won't be back." "You'd better be right," she muttered, scribbling out their check and handing it to him. Mako passed it over to Asami without a word and ignored her indignant look. "I have some experience with gangs. We'll get out of your hair, but do you know how to get to Hyphon Avenue? I'm looking for number 98. She turned to him so fast that her hair fell loose again. "What? Why? You know the place." "I would hope so, I live there." Chapter 32, Fire and Ice. "Why are you looking for my house?" Wow, that's convenient." Mako took out his wallet and removed the picture of his parents that he kept in the back. "That's the address I have for my mom's family, her name was Naoki. Naoki Hishimura." She took the picture and slowly looked it over while Mako ignored the "we don't have time for this" look from Korra. Instead he studied the waitress, and she did seem to have the same sharp features as his mother, the prominent cheekbones and tapering jaw in particular. She was of a height with him, too. Her brow furrowed up, but then she shrugged. "This looks like the pictures my mom has of Aunt Naoki. I'm guessing you're the kid with the dumb eyebrows here. Oh, you'll get along great with these three, anyway, I guess I'm your cousin, then." "Mako. This is Asami, Korra, and Kuvira. Sachiko Hishimura," she said, an instant before a shot of recognition struck her. "Wait. That Korra? That Kuvira? The Avatar and the Earth Queen. And that Asami," the third woman said dryly, leaning against the counter. "Guess word travels fast." Korra nodded. "Yeah, that's us. And we really should be getting back to our airship." "It's no good until we get that part," Kuvira said in an attempt to placate her. "You said Mako couldn't look for his family, and he didn't. It's more like he tripped and fell into them. You're supposed to be on my side." "I'm not taking sides, but she's right here." Sachiko waved at them. "Hey. She has a name. Look, Mako, if you really are my cousin, then come by and meet my mom. Your little street fighting display scared off the rest of my customers, so I might as well close up for the day. It's costing me money to have this place open for nothing more than a trickle. Let me send my chef home and grab my jacket." Korra rubbed 2 fingers to her unscarred temple while Sachiko disappeared into the back. "Fine. We can't do anything else while we're stuck here, we might as well see if we can get any more of that spicy carp trout." "Thanks, Korra." She gave him a courtesy smile, the kind that didn't go all the way up to her eyes, but he was grateful all the same. Sachiko came back out after a moment with a light red jacket, cleared out the register, and ushered them onto the street before locking up. "It's that way," she said, pointing down the next block. "Try not to beat up any more triads, okay? These blazing monsoon guys," Asami said as they walked. How long have they been a problem? About 4 months now, I guess. It seemed ridiculous at first, water-bending triads in the Fire Nation, but we're right on the coast, so there's never a shortage of water, and most of the firebenders work inland at the mines. If I wasn't stuck as one of their clients, I'd think it was actually pretty brilliant. Bastards. There was such venom in her voice that Mako felt it striking at him in hot waves. Korra and Asami both glanced at him, their thoughts plain on their faces, and an uncomfortable sense of guilt twisted around his heart. "Aren't you a firebender?" he asked. Sachiko nodded and took one hand from her jacket pocket, holding a handful of flame in her palm for a moment before snuffing it out. "Yeah. So's Yumi, but a fat lot of good it'd do to have me and my little sister go up against a bunch of gangsters." "Right. How come you're all the way out here?" "I read in the paper that the Avatar was going back to the Earth Kingdom since it's a mess. Fire Lord Izumi's still alive, unless something changed since this morning," Sachiko said, turning and walking backward to address the women behind her. "I mean, you're the Earth Queen, and that's cool, you can go wherever you want, but it seems like you're taking the long way around to get to the Earth Kingdom." Kuvira scratched the back of her neck, the little motion she used when she wanted to surreptitiously tug on her braid. "I thought it was important to meet with the Fire Lord, so we turned around. Right now we're waiting on a replacement part for our airship." She could talk around the whole truth, Mako thought. Not the worst trait for a politician. "You're still a ways from Kasai." Sachiko directed them onto a cross street. Mako looked up and saw the name, Haifan Avenue. "Right down here." "The triads, are they the reason the streets are almost totally empty?" Mako asked. "People are scared. You have triads in Republic City, don't you know what it's like?" "You could say that," he mumbled. She turned into the front yard of a small house with several rows of happy pink chinensis roses on either side of the door. They all bumped into one another while she paused to produce a key from her pocket. Sachiko guided them inside and locked the door behind them while they removed their boots in favor of the guest slippers lined up in the entryway. "Mom? Yumi?" "I'm home," she said, bringing them through a narrow hallway and into the kitchen. There was a younger woman, maybe 20 or 21, at the table with a long ponytail that reached down to her waist, idly puffing handfuls of smoke into the air. An older woman stood at the kitchen's stove, lighting a burner with her firebending. She glanced back when they walked in, surveying the newcomers with wary eyes, and Mako's breath caught in his throat. There were streaks of gray and white in her wavy black hair, and she might have been a bit broader in the shoulders, but she was otherwise his mother's spitting image. "I brought people," Sachiko said, lazily waving her hand at them. "I've got the Avatar, the Earth Queen, this guy who says he's our cousin, and—" "Hey, are you Asami Sato?" the girl at the table asked. It took her a moment to realize that it was her being recognized rather than Korra or Kuvira, but then a small grin crept over her lips. "The one and only." "Oh, wow, I'm Yumi, I like to build things like you, would you take a look at this water clock I put together?" She didn't wait for an answer before hopping up out of her seat and dragging a bemused, if flattered, Asami back down the hall. Sachiko rolled her eyes. "Well, I've still got these 3. Her mother bowed deeply, clasping her hands together as she did. "Avatar Korra. Your Majesty. You honor our home. My name is Tomiko, what brings you to our village?" "Engine trouble," Korra said. "Our airship broke down, and we found Sachiko's restaurant when we stopped for lunch." And despite being told not to, she continued, leveling a tired look at Mako, "He got his mother's old address, which happens to be this house." "Your mother?" Tomiko asked, turning to him. Mako brought out his family picture again and turned it over to her. She studied it closely, putting on a pair of glasses from her pocket and running her fingers over the old film. The wary look in her eyes softened after a moment. "Oh, Naoki, this is you, then." "That's me, the good-looking one." She handed the photo back and hugged him before putting them all at the table. Sit. I'll make you something." "They just ate, Mom," Sachiko said, but her words fell on deaf ears. Instead they had to have another helping of spicy carp trout and try a particularly strong bit of steak before Tomiko was satisfied, and even then she commented on how bony Mako seemed. It's kind of weird not being focused on, isn't it? Cora asked, sitting at one end of the table. Kuvira shook her head and nestled into Cora's side with another helping of sake. The word you're looking for is nice. Let him have this, it gives us a chance to relax. She grumbled in response, but a kiss silenced her well enough. Mako turned back to Tomiko and Sachiko, the latter of whom looked askance at the women before shrugging. I thought the papers were making that up. Naoki was a pro-bender. Tomiko asked, gently nudging him back into the story he had been telling. Only for the one season, that's how she met my dad. He was one of the medics on duty the night she broke her arm, near the end of the season. Good thing she was injured. Well, for me, anyway. I think there's some rule against playing while you're pregnant, so she retired before the next season started. Tomiko nodded and sipped at her tea. She always was looking for excitement. Scared our parents half to death sometimes. Oh. Mako let the words cut into him, shrugging it off as best he could while his heart twisted. She started teaching after that, he said, trying to continue. Needed something less physical to do. His fingers drummed on the table, and his cousin put a hand on his. You really miss her, Sachiko said, and Mako thought it must have been the first thing she said to him that wasn't deeply sardonic. Something burned in his throat. Damn spicy carp trout. Yeah. She softened up a bit toward him after that in some way that was only barely perceptible to him, but he stopped dead when she ventured to ask her own questions. So what do you do? Other than run around with two of the most powerful women in the world, I mean. He had to think about her question before looking to the other end of the table, where Cora and Kuvira were seeing how close they could put a finger to each other's noses without actually touching. Oh, them. Seeing them struggling to get up every morning and falling over one another while half-naked had left Mako somewhat less than starstruck, and to him they were just Cora and Kuvira. It took a moment to remember that they were Avatar Cora and Queen Kuvira to everyone other than him and Asami. Well, globe-trotting misadventures aside, I ran a construction company. It wasn't a lie, he thought, but it was certainly dishonest. He always had a way to pull focus from himself, though. Bolin's the one with the fun job, he's the vice president. Of what? Sachiko asked. The whole damn United Republic. Mako decided to leave out the coup he had staged and the fact that he was still wielding most of the country's power, leaving Tenzin to take the blame for whatever he did. It's a bit more interesting than my job, or so I hear. Never really cared for politics. Or most politicians, really. He refused to meet the unamused looks of the Queen and the Crown Princess at the end of the table. The afternoon wore away, and the sun began to set as Tomiko wheedled out every story she could about her little sister. No matter how trivial or unimportant it might have seemed to Mako, she wanted to hear it. She only paused to begin preparing dinner, despite their insistence that they were quite full. Asami returned with Yumi shortly before the food was ready, and Mako didn't fail to notice the messy ponytail that her usually perfectly coiffed hair had become. He ground his tongue between his teeth and pulled her to the hallway, out of earshot of everyone else. Hey, she said, slippers slapping on the wooden floor. Miss me that much? That's my cousin, Mako said under his breath, jerking his head back toward the kitchen. Asami cocked an eyebrow, as if waiting for him to say more. And? What difference? Oh, you're gross, you know that. I don't know what goes on in your daydreams, but here in the real world it isn't my mission in life to jump on every woman I meet, she hissed back, punching him square in the chest. But since you're so intent on making everything sexual, maybe Cora would like to hear what you did with her cousins. Okay. Point taken. I don't need her out of my blood. We really were looking over her designs, that's why I put my hair up. She's brilliant. Quit being a pervert. She hit again and returned to the kitchen. Mako didn't think his suspicions were entirely unjustified, considering the proclivities of the people he was stuck spending all of his time with, but he decided to let the matter rest. Women, he muttered, and followed her. There was a great deal of steamed rice with a tangy hot sauce drizzled on top to go around, along with sushi wrapped in seaweed and dumplings packed with meat. Between lunch, the second lunch, and now dinner, Mako was nearly full to bursting, and his companions hardly looked any better. Sachiko and Yumi seemed fine, and he had to wonder where all the food went, considering they were as rail-thin as he was. Tomiko brought them into the living room afterward for tea, a sweet jasmine affair that Mako thought could have benefited from more steeping. While Yumi grilled Asami about engineering, Mako slipped over to the front door, put his boots back on, and stepped outside. Apart from the highest snow-capped peaks on the larger islands, it never got properly cold in the Fire Nation, and it seemed like the occasional cool breeze over the humid night air was the coldest Saife got. Everything was deathly still, silent but for his own breathing and the turning doorknob behind him. "You okay?" Sachiko asked, stepping up to his side. "Couldn't take any more of Yumi's babbling either, huh? I never know what she's on about half the time. She's just excited that there's someone here who can keep up." "No, it's you guys and your mom." "It's nice," he said, letting her arm work around his own. "Reminds me of my mom. Bolin and I know the other side of our family. We grabbed them from Ba Sing Se years ago, but that's his side. He's the earthbender. And I guess I was always closer with my mom." Sachiko made a small, affirmative noise, watching the fireflies with him until they gradually turned to face one another. "Well, we're your half of that family. I'm glad you wandered into my restaurant. I'm glad you beat up those guys." She took a half step forward until they were very, very close. "I'm glad I met you. She's your cousin, she's your cousin, she's your cousin," he thought furiously, although the fact didn't seem to perturb her much. He had enough issues, Mako knew, there was no reason to compound them. One of her hands found its way to his hip, and he was never so glad to have something stinging him in the neck to distract him. Wait. His thoughts clouded up, and he saw something sticking out of Sachiko's neck before they both hit the ground. Despite his best efforts, not even the tips of his fingers would move, as if he were encased in ice. Breathing became a challenge, and he fought for every mouthful of air as his chest locked up. "Yeah, that's him," he heard. There was a sharp pain on the side of his head, and then nothing. He'd better still be alive. "It's only Shirshu toxin, boss. Even if we got him in the heart, it wouldn't kill him. Don't know when he'll come to, but he'll burn out the venom sooner or later. These fucking spark plugs run too hot for it to last as long as it should. Get me as soon as he wakes up. And keep up the chi blocking until then, on both of them. The correct chakra, Naku. As much as you might want to return the favor, hitting his water chakra won't actually keep him from firebending." Yeah. What was that?" "Oh, nothing, boss. I'll make sure you know as soon as he's awake." Footsteps. Boots on dry earth. A door falling shut against a frame. Mako made note of it all, or did the best he could while a haze still hung over his thoughts. He heard another bout of labored breathing nearby, likely from Sachiko, probably cuffed to a chair like him. One set of footsteps made a circuit around them, and though he didn't want to chance opening his eyes yet, the room they were in seemed not all that large. A holding cell, maybe. Water was flowing nearby. Underground. Something warm and wet tricked down the side of his neck, where the toxin had struck. Maybe blood. It ran down to where the collar of his jacket would have been, had he not been stripped to the waist. There was a soreness forming over his stomach, guaranteed to leave an unsightly and sensitive bruise. "Focus, you idiot." When he was sure the man named Naku had his back to him, Mako tried calling up a spark by flicking his fingers together behind his back. The cuffs cut into his wrists at the motion, but a flame plumed in his hand. Either the last round of chi blocking had worn off, or it had never worked in the first place. The fire chakra wasn't an easy chi path to get to, partially protected by the ribcage as it was. Naku's footsteps stopped, and Mako heard a few jabbing strikes followed by a pained groan. Definitely Sachiko. His jaw clenched. His cousin was blunt and acerbic and bitingly sardonic, and he liked that about her. Hearing her in pain wasn't high on his list of priorities, but there was nothing he could do before another set of strikes flew into his own stomach and up to his chest. The energy swirling in his fingertips died out instantly, and he couldn't suppress a cough. Naku grabbed him by the chin and pitched his head back, causing him to recoil from the light overhead. "Rise and shine, Mako," he said, jostling his head a bit. One of the men from the restaurant, he saw. The one he took down with a hard palm to the water chakra. I must be a pretty popular guy if you know who I am. There was no response for a moment while Naka went to the door and gave it 3 short raps. Oh yeah, real popular. The boss wants to see you. And then I'm going to beat you so bloody you won't even remember your own name. I'd like to see you try, Mako spat back. Naka drew some water from a skin on his hip, hardened it into a thick sheet of ice, and cracked it across Mako's face. His head spun, and small spots dotted his vision for several seconds. The ice liquefied and disappeared into the water skin as the door creaked open. Good to see you again, Mako. He looked up with bleary eyes at the strangely familiar voice, and found a lithe water tribe man with awful slicked back hair. Fastfoot Feng. Oh, it's just Feng now. I could hardly believe it when Naka dragged you in here. You'll never stop being a thorn in my side, will you? He asked, kneeling down and giving Mako a few light slaps on the cheek. Poached 8 of my best waterbenders in Republic City, drove me out after all we've been though, and now you've fallen into my lap all the way out here. Small world, you're a long way from the North Pole, Mako said, straining against the cuffs that held firm around his wrists. Guess I got tired of rooting around in the ice and snow. The hot springs just weren't worth it, I catch colds way too easily. You poor thing. That earned him a harder slap. But the air here? All the sand and warm water? Does wonders for me. Not to mention how far it is from everything, even the mines down south. Very quiet, very isolated. Great place for me and my new friends. He drew one finger up along Mako's throat, letting a flow from his water skin coalesce on his nail until there was a sharp, icy point pressing into the soft skin beneath his mouth. Should have known it was you. No one else could come up with a name as dumb as Blazing Monsoon. The ice pierced his skin, digging into the sensitive flesh there with a sickening pain. Always had a smart mouth for a kid. Shame you never could use it properly. Feng drew the ice away, but not before twisting his finger to make the wound a little wider. You're so lucky there's no full moon tonight, I'd bend the blood right through your skin. Even that might not kill you, I know firsthand how much of a pounding you can take, he said, giving Mako a humorless smile before turning his pale blue eyes on Sachiko. But that's okay. I don't need to beat you to hurt you. The cuffs cut deeply into his wrists as Mako worked against them, rocking the chair to get free until Naka held him still by his throat. Feng walked slowly over to Sachiko, so slowly that Mako knew he was doing it to rile him. He popped the cork on his water skin and elongated the ice on his finger, turning it into a long, thin blade that covered his whole hand. You son of a bitch. That's not nice. Especially since my mother is still alive. Feng took a swipe at Sachiko's shirt, rending the white fabric over her stomach before red stained through. The only response she could muster was a weak moan. So who's this one to you? Your girlfriend. I doubt you jumped in off the street because you couldn't stand the injustice of it all. The only restaurants your guys didn't touch were the equalist owned ones. How's Asami doing, by the way? Kill you, Mako choked out, fighting for breath in Naka's grip. I'll kill you. You've had more than enough chances. He poked his blade into Sachiko's thigh, and her half-lidded eyes began to water. Tears rolled down her cheeks as he twisted the ice and made a spurt of blood spray onto her lap. Feng sighed and returned to Mako, pushing Naka out of the way and leveling the blade at Mako's bare chest. No, you've got it backwards. I'm going to kill you. Not tonight. Not anytime soon. The ice pierced his right shoulder, driving easily into the muscle there. Mako hissed and stamped his foot while pain silenced all of his thoughts. Blood ran down his side and onto his pants, the chair, the floor. So much red. So much pain. I'm going to make you want it first, Feng said, pulling out and leaning down until their faces were level. His free hand gripped Mako's chin while his thumb pressed into Mako's open mouth. Make it so you're crawling on your hands and knees, begging for it. And then, maybe, I'll indulge you. He forced Mako's head up so he could look into his eyes when a loud bang from another room wiped the Angwin smile from his face. Everything around them trembled, and Mako could vaguely hear what sounded like wind howling through an enclosed space. My friends might not like that. The door flew clean off its hinges, taking out an inattentive Naku. Feng whipped around, but Asami was already on him, sending a blast of air at his legs and jamming her shock glove into his chest. Korra and Kuvira spilled in after her, throwing metal strips that shoved Feng and Naku into the far wall by their necks. The handcuffs fastening them to the chairs fell away with a flick of Kuvira's wrist, and she had to run to catch Sachiko before she fell over. "We missed cake for this," Korra said, further securing the triads with stone cuffs around their waists and ankles. "I'll bake you another one." Mako tried to bring his hands into his lap, but his right arm wouldn't budge. Blood only streamed down toward his wrist and waist when he tried. Korra yanked Feng's ice away from his hand and melted it, but Mako shook his head when she brought it to his shoulder. "Her first. You could have nerve damage. I'll live, take care of her. She's still full of Shirshu toxin." Something that someone else might have mistaken for concern flashed briefly on her face, but then Korra nodded and took the water to Sachiko. Kuvira fished through Naku's pockets and eventually found a small vial of anti-venin. There looked to be only one dose, but that was fine. He had burned it out of his system already. He ran hot, one of the fringe benefits of being a lightning bender. A spark plug. Dizziness hit him as he stood up, and Asami threw his good arm over her shoulder. "Thanks for the backup," he said, fatigue wearing on his voice as the adrenaline faded. "Still think I'm an arrogant, egotistical prick?" "Of course." He rolled his eyes as another bead of blood trickled down his chest. "That's the worst apology I've ever gotten." Asami gave him a quick, chaste peck on the cheek. "But you're my arrogant, egotistical prick. I'll take it." The anti-venin ran its course, and Sachiko began sobbing once she had control over her body again. She grabbed at her stomach and thigh while Korra worked the water over her, running her fingers over the mending wounds. She healed the cuts, and Sachiko curled up with a shudder. "How'd you find us?" Mako asked. "Someone started beating up the nearest triads when we noticed you two were gone," Kuvira said, looking pointedly at the avatar. "You're still my responsibility," Korra grumbled as she ran the water over his shoulder. She worked for a few moments before hardening it and lobbing the ice at Feng's head. "You'll need a sling for a few days. And we should get this blood off. I need, you know." "What?" "Your consent. It's not in me anymore." "Blood, bend away." She glanced at Asami, who nodded, and then brought her hands in tight, jerky spirals along Mako's side. It must have been easier than bending blood inside the body, he thought. All the blood slipped off his skin and landed in a small circular pool by the door. It was a bit nauseating to see so much of it outside himself. "There. Now put a shirt on." Mako didn't think he looked that bad, but then Korra's interest in men at all was suspect. He found his jacket and scarf and slipped them on before going over to Sachiko. She was still trembling, her breaths ragged and uneven, and he took her hand as gently as he could. "It's okay, Sachiko. The police can come and clean up in here. Let's get you back home, all right?" She let him stand her up and follow the others out with her arms around his and Asami's shoulders. It was some kind of compound, either underground or in a hill outside Xife. Korra absently stepped over several triads in varying states of consciousness, all bound to the walls with thick earthen cuffs. The air tasted stale. It wasn't recycling, Mako realized. They were underground. His guess was confirmed when they ascended a set of rough stairs and emerged in what appeared to be a storage shed behind a building that had been thoroughly leveled by earthbending. Mako nodded appreciatively to Korra and Kuvira, and while the queen smiled back, the avatar never changed the look of restrained relief on her face. They weren't far from Sachiko's house, and Yumi nearly bowled them over when they came through the door, crying and clawing desperately at her sister. Both of them fell into one another right there in the entryway, sinking to their knees while everyone scrambled to get out of their way. "You're okay," Yumi mumbled, as much to herself as to Sachiko. "You're okay, you're okay." Somehow they corralled both of them into the kitchen, where Tomiko was putting on tea. She grabbed both of her daughters in a bone-crushing hug, trying very hard to maintain what was left of her composure. Everyone but Mako sank into seats around the table while he tied his scarf into a crude sling for his arm. "I could hear most of what was going on," Sachiko said, her voice weak as she looked up at Mako. "That guy seemed to know you." He nodded slowly. "Yeah, he knew me. I knew him. I thought I did, anyway." We have a history. I'm the one that threw him and his friends out of Republic City 4 months ago. Mako, Asami began. No, I'm not going to lie to them. I've done enough lying for 3 lifetimes. He took a long, deep breath while everyone looked at him intently. I didn't know they'd end up here. I thought they'd go to one of the water tribes. I drove them out because I ran another triad, and I didn't want the competition. The words hung in the air like an unwelcome odor for several minutes before Sachiko got to her feet. Her tired expression hardened, and her hands balled into reddened, shaking fists. So you're just like them? All you do is bend fire instead of water. He nodded, unable to meet her gaze. The force of her punch reopened the scar cutting through the end of his left eyebrow, and he felt the skin around his eye swelling up before he finished staggering back. Get out, she seethed. Get out. Hey, he's done, Korra started. No. She's right. He turned away and wiped a line of blood from his brow. I'll stay with the ship. Mako didn't look back at them before he closed the door. He didn't deserve that. Once he laced up his boots on the porch, as quickly as he could with one good arm, he left, reaching the sidewalk before the door opened again. Asami caught up with him, as did Korra and Kuvira, and they navigated the empty streets in silence. The few fishing boats out on the water rocked with the waves that lapped at the shore, stopping short of where Mako sat on the sun-baked sand. His good hand held a bundle of ice to his eye, and while the swelling wasn't as bad as he thought it would be, the burst blood vessels left a shimmering splotch to match the bruise on his stomach. The sand crunched close behind him. Korra's back with the supplies, and Asami's nearly done with the engine, Kuvira said. We'll be ready to leave after that. She sat beside him as he nodded. Good. Coming here was a mistake. I should have let it be. You really did those things you talked about last night? She asked, idly bending some sand between her feet into a spiral. Running the triple threat triad? Yeah, that was true. Ask Asami. I kicked Feng out after a few years of begrudging cooperation, and then it was only my outfit left. I was pretty damn good at it too, if I'm being honest. That's the history I have with your aunt. Most of it, anyway. And then Korra blew up a warehouse around me and got me thrown in jail. She likes telling that part of the story, Kuvira said, letting the sand fall so she could fix the end of her braid. I really can't see you that way, though. To me you're just some guy who gets along with my mom and my brother. You can't go 10 minutes without snarking at something, but I don't think you're that bad. That's because you don't know me well enough. His mirthless laugh devolved into a painful moan as he remembered how damaged his stomach was. I guess a week in jail and getting carted around by the Avatar has that effect on people. Feng was never that bad in Republic City, but he'd been at this a lot longer than me. All night, I was thinking that if I'm going to wind up that far gone, then I don't want to be that person anymore. I don't think you are. Wait, hear me out, Kuvira added before he could say anything. You ran like someone lit a fire underneath you to help Korra and Zaofu, when even I didn't trust her. My mom said you threw yourself between her and some wolves without a thought. Yesterday you went and trounced 3 triads and got your cousin healed up before yourself. I don't think you would have done all that if you were still the person you think you are. He took the ice from his eye and looked over at her. It gave him pause to think that the Earth Queen of all people was sitting at his side, trying to talk him up. Then again, she had dispensed with any regalia in favor of her usual olive clothes, which made it somewhat more believable. She put a hand on his undamaged shoulder until he returned her smile. Thanks, Kuvira. I only wish it was as easy to feel it as it is to listen to you say it. The Pepper's rotors began spinning up, accompanied by a victorious, incoherent shout from Asami. Both of them stood and looked once more in the direction of Jisaife. You did a good thing here, Mako. A good thing. Another smile crept over his lips, unbidden but not unwanted. He took a deep breath, and the weight, the pain, the soft ache in his heart diminished, flowing away as he exhaled. It's a start. Chapter 33, Peacekeepers. What a damn mess. Lin drummed her fingers on the windowsill of the observation tower, looking down over the sorry excuse for basing SE's agrarian zone. It was the largest stretch of land not scorched to uselessness, and after several days with a team of almost 100 earthbenders, she and Sue had fashioned a respectable base camp. From the observation deck atop the main tower, the ruins of the city were easily visible, stretching almost to the eastern horizon. She noted with some dark humor that at sunset, the tower's shadow thrust through a gap in the outer wall. Fires were burning all over the city, freshly stoked. Everyone they couldn't take in lit their fires at sunset, before it became too dark to see what they were doing. Before it became that much harder to make it through one more night. It would have been easy enough to expand the base camp to take in more refugees, but they were out of beds, out of blankets, and their supply lines from Omasha were already strained. Even with earthbenders tilling huge swaths of fallow land for a frantic harvest, there wouldn't be nearly enough food. Summer was half gone already, and too many people were starving as it was. Winter would come sooner than any of them would have liked, and they would have to leave before snow blocked the supply lines. All they could do was repair what they could in the little time they had and hope it wasn't for the sake of fixing up a necropolis. I never liked coming here. Sue came up the stairs from the conference room below them, setting 2 plates of food on a table where they could overlook a good stretch of the camp. Lynn sat opposite her and picked at the dumplings on her plate. Do you remember the summer that Mom dumped us on Grandma and Grandpa and they brought us here? Unfortunately. A solid week of, oh, isn't this fountain marvelous and, this is how the nobility should live, not cooped up in a police office, Sue said, putting on an exaggerated imitation of their grandmother. Lynn looked down at the neat little rows of tents and the soldiers buzzing about, shoring up the walls or carting supplies to one of the refugee mess halls at the edge of the camp. I guess I didn't take that last one to heart. Sue laughed, and Lynn found herself joining in, if only reluctantly. Loath as she was to admit it, being away from Republic City, away from all the intrigues and the politicking, was pleasantly refreshing. They got simple, straightforward missions, and though they were often mind-numbingly dull for her taste, there was no stuffy procedure, no answering to a civilian oversight board, and blessedly enough, not nearly as much paperwork. She turned in a single perfunctory report, and that was that. Of course, she knew they weren't being sent to the front lines where teams were taking the city back block by block, but even so, there was a certain fulfillment to the outreach and survey tasks they were given. Hearts and minds, Iroh called it. Sue's department, certainly, although Lynn had a soft spot for the kids they found in ruined, burned-out houses. No, you didn't. You took their tut-tutang in stride, though. Sue leaned back in her chair and looked out over the city. Her grin turned downward. We're not going to be able to save all of them. Not even most of them. Kuvira said it was bad, but, it's like we're trying to save a ruin at this point. There's still time, Lynn said, even if the words felt hollow to her. Don't forget how many earthbenders we have. And there are plenty of people in that ruin, trying to survive. I know. Watching the fires burn through the sunset while they ate was strangely beautiful, creating pinpricks of red and yellow light against a darkened backdrop. Their small meals were gone soon enough, and they sat there in silence, watching the various floodlights come to life around the camp. You really think we can save it? Sue asked in a hushed tone. There was no one else on the observation deck, and Lynn wondered if her sister thought speaking quietly would make it seem any less coldly pragmatic. The people? We'll do what we can. Some of the relief centers along the border should be ready by now. Mako's people work fast, I'll give them that. The city, maybe some of it. We won't ever get into the middle ring fighting block by block, though. If we torched and bulldozed the shanty towns and set up actual, stable earthen structures, we could at least start rehoming some of these people. Sticking them in tents isn't going to help long term. She had more to say, plenty more, as it happened, but they both turned to the noise on the stairs and saw General Iroh coming up to the otherwise empty deck. The back of her neck suddenly felt very hot. They fell silent, and he gave them a quick nod when he saw them at the far table. Governor. Chief. Is everything all right? Oh, we're not in my province and she retired, Sue and Lynn are fine. Leave of absence, Lynn muttered. Whatever. We were just thinking about rehoming options for the refugees. I see. He went to one of the windows with a clipboard and looked out over the camp. Well, please let me know if you have any ideas you'd like to share. I won't disturb you. Lin shrank in her seat, extending and retracting the tip of the blade on her forearm, while Su steepled her fingers with a smirk. What? She looked at her sister, cocked an eyebrow, and looked pointedly at Iroh, who had his back to them while he did his nightly survey. The change in their bleak conversation was welcome enough, but it was quickly going down a road she didn't care for. No, Lin said, raising her voice until she was just out earshot of him. I'm friends with his mother. Come on, broody firebender. That's your type, isn't it? You can scowl at me all you want, you know I'm right. Knock it off. You were getting along in the convoy, weren't you? Su asked. We were going over the city layout. Su rolled her eyes and leaned in further. Okay, wait. Is this actual reticence, or the kind where you want me to bring you around eventually? Because I think we both agree you have some steam to let off. Lin crossed her arms and huffed, glaring at her own lap. Carrying on a hushed conversation was surprisingly stressful. 50-50, she admitted, and Su gave her a smug little smile. What's the worst that could happen? Abject humiliation and possible censure, for starters. The correct answer is, he could say no. How did you ever get anywhere with Tenzin? Did he do absolutely everything? I had a lot more confidence back then, Lin said, bending the tines of her fork into helices. My hair wasn't gray and everything was still perky. Su reached over and tapped a few times on the metal armor covering Lin's chest, stopping only when Lin pushed her back with a furious shade of crimson on her face. You don't have to test it, okay? Trust me on this one. I think you're running yourself down for the sake of an excuse. You know there were guys that were interested, you told me so yourself, so stow all the negative self-talk. Give it a fair try, you might be surprised. And then maybe you'd stop being so damn grouchy all the time. Lin had no time to retort before Su raised her voice. That's a great idea. General, you really should hear my sister's thoughts on developments for the lower ring. He looked up from his clipboard, only just coming back to the present moment. Lin shot Su the foulest glare she could muster before turning to face him. You had a plan, Chief. She got up, almost feeling her heart thudding against her armor, while Su smirked and watched her go to the window. There was no reason for the jitters, she told herself, and she almost felt angry at her body for overreacting after such a long stretch of dormancy. Instead she took a weak hold of the iron in her blood, a technique they had developed when the fight against the Equalists had been truly desperate, and clumsily calmed her heart. She had to work through a sudden wave of coldness and a head rush, but it brought her back to baseline quickly enough. Lin is fine. Okay, Lin, then. What was it you had in mind? Right now, we can only house a few hundred refugees in the camp, and the rest are stuck outside the perimeter. We should reuse the space we have so that divide doesn't exist. She pointed to the remains of a slum in the lower ring, little more than a few freestanding wood walls and the occasional bit of metal in the detritus. That block, for example. We were there the other day. Whatever's still standing is a total loss, and wouldn't come anywhere close to passing an inspection. If we had the heavy equipment clear it out, our earthbenders could set up modular shelters based on simple designs. Much harder to burn down stone. Right, start cleaning up the lower ring and give them a semblance of normalcy at once. Go on, he said. Torching everything might not go over well, but using firebenders to clear out the lost causes and then having earthbenders set up something afterward would start stemming the flow of people to the camp. If we have to fight for every block, we might as well leave it better than we found it, Lin said, putting a hand on his shoulder as casually as she could manage, while pointing to where their teams had stopped for the day. I see what you mean. And we are running out of space here, even for the soldiers. My only concern is the scope of our operation. Iroh looked out over to the darkened horizon, where the twisted remains of the palace stood. Queen Kuvira only gave her consent for us to secure the city, not reshape it. Lin let her hand slip down in between his shoulder blades, which also garnered no real response. My niece is a pragmatic woman. I'm sure she would take it in the manner in which it's intended. She had no idea if that was true. Kuvira had been shut up in a hospital room for almost the entire week and Lin had her own matters to attend to. Still, she rather wanted the idea to land. Flirting or not, she knew it was a good plan and would at least start relieving the refugee problem. Maybe So was right. Maybe she did just need to give it a fair try. Iroh suppressed a yelp as her hand drifted slightly lower than she intended, and he loudly cleared his throat while backing up toward the stairs. Yes, well, that'll be something I'll see about getting done, Chief. I should go. Ladies. He almost tripped getting himself down the stairs, and Lin let her forehead hit the window with a soft thump. Okay, that was good, So lied, coming up beside her. She hit her head on the glass again. You might have gotten a little overzealous at the end there, but it was a good start, really. I want to die, Lin muttered. That'll stop in a few minutes. Maybe don't go for the ass so quickly next time. Next time? There's not going to be any next time, so. This might be how you get your kicks, but right now I'm so mortified I want to jump through this window. Okay. Don't jump through the window, it'll look bad. Plus, you know, you'll die. So laughed weakly at her own joke, but Lin didn't even sneer, and instead only stared out at the camp. Come on, I want surly Lin back, I don't like this Lin. She looks all mopey and depressed. This Lin is easy to read, she mumbled. Alright, let's just get you back on solid ground, So said, tugging at her hand. Lin followed without resistance, and seemed very interested in her own feet as they descended the stairs. This is not how I get my kicks, by the way. Do you want to see how it's done? Not on Iroh, he's probably spooked right now. They descended to another level, a storage room full of maps of the city and the surrounding areas, where a few soldiers on punitive cleaning detail were going over every piece of paper with small brushes, wiping away dust. This sounds suspiciously like a way to get you laid instead of me. Well, you clearly need some kind of instruction. Another floor of the tower, a honeycomb of supply closets, came and went as they continued down. Lin didn't remember helping set that one up. You really haven't done this since Tenzin, have you? No. That was more than 20 years ago, do you at least, I mean. Lin cringed. She didn't want the conversation going there, sisters or not. Fine, just show me. It's got to be less painful than talking about this. Sue's face lit up, but Lin wasn't sure if it was for the teaching moment or the opportunity to pursue her own gratification. Either way, it put a spring in her step, and they passed the next few floors in a blur. I see at least one of us inherited Mom's promiscuity. This really isn't cheating to you, she asked, skittering down the steps to keep up with her sister. Nope. Whatever. Their marriage isn't my problem. So dragged her through the base camp, lit by temporary floodlights and torches on high, narrow stakes. They were both outside of the actual command structure, more of an advisory and oversight team than anything, and that afforded them a measure of privacy and anonymity as they walked. It's simple, really. Men are easy. Women need a little more finesse and there might not be quite as much choice, but I doubt you care much about that. I don't, Lin said flatly. She really didn't know her sister that well after all. They arrived at the tiny bar attached to the enlisted commissary. Lin liked her fair share of alcohol, more than her fair share if her doctor was to be believed, but it seemed like an unnecessary extravagance in the middle of a military encampment to her. Still, the soldiers needed a way to blow off steam, she supposed. A good stiff drink did more than any bout of counseling after days on end of pulling dead kids out of the rubble. It was packed, as it always was at night, and only a few people glanced up as they entered. Lin put a few bills on the bar and pointed out the Kaoliang while So took the seat next to her. The private on bartending duty poured her a highball, but Lin grabbed her wrist before she could move away. Leave the bottle, she said, putting a few more bills down. She shrugged, collected the money, and went to pour another order. This might not work if you drink yourself into a stupor. Lin belted back the drink in one smooth gulp, shuddering as it burned its way down her throat. The fuzzy shroud it threw over her thoughts only made things better. We all have our vices. Go to work. Try to watch at least a little in between bouts of drowning your sorrows, okay? I'm doing this for you. Now let's see what we have here. So cast a casual glance over the room. They had a good vantage point from the end of the bar, but most of the other patrons were in small groups and focused either on their drinks or their conversations. Her gaze eventually settled on a lone corporal at the other end of the bar, who Lin recognized. One of the military liaisons that had worked with the police in Republic City, and a part of their security detail in Ba Sing Se before being rotated out 2 days prior. The red stripe on his collar marked him as a firebender, although Lin had never seen him use it. Okay. Try not to drink all of that. Lin scowled. If Su could have her trysts, she could have her drinks. Her sister slipped out of her seat, moving through the room with a dancer's grace before settling in beside the corporal, leaning with her back to the bar as she struck up a conversation. Or it looked that way, at any rate. Lin couldn't make out anything either of them were saying. What good is this if I can't hear you? It almost reminded her of the reconnoitering she did as a detective, sitting in a car in the dead of night with a partner and too much coffee. She was good at that, at least. The bar was made of stone, a crude and hasty construction, and she could have slammed her foot against the side to get at least a snapshot of what they were saying. But she didn't want to, she realized. None of it was what she wanted. She still watched, vaguely interested in how fast it was going to be, and so was already whispering something into his ear that turned his face beet red. They left shortly after, so leading him by a single finger she had hooked into his fatigues. She turned back for the briefest of moments, and Lin raised her glass in acknowledgement. Nursing the remainder of the Kaoliang was fine with her. A cool wave of contentment washed over her, starkly different from the warmth provided by her drink. It was only then that she realized that she hadn't thought of Tenzin since they left Republic City, hadn't been kept awake by memories, hadn't given herself over to the oh-so-satisfying recurring daydream where she arrested Pema. There had been a job to focus on. Being in a war zone brought her a measure of peace, and the irony burned as much as her next drink. Someone sat down beside her and ordered, and her stomach dropped out when she glanced over. He had changed into ordinary fatigues and had his hair done a different way, but it was Iroh. There was no hiding Izumi's cheekbones or the bright amber in his eyes. Lin scowled and fumbled with her bottle, making him look over and blanch. "Ah, Chief. Slumming it tonight, General?" she asked, unable to bear looking him in the eye. Instead she focused hard on a stain on the bar in front of her. "I like to see how things are going with the troops every now and then. Besides, they don't have this brand of sake in the officers' bar. Which you were more than welcome to avail yourself of, by the way." "Yeah." She belted back another mouthful. "Listen, about before my sister put me up to that. It did seem remarkably out of character for you. I was flattered, really, but I'm spoken for." "Oh." That lifted her spirits a bit. "Or it might have been the Kaoliang. Can I ask, who?" "Admiral Yin. I think you met briefly, before her battleship group started around the northern coast. They'll be stopping here to take on supplies in a week or two. I won't mention this evening to her." "I appreciate that." She looked at her bottle with glassy eyes. There was still half of it left. "Guess you two have a lot in common." He grinned into his drink. "You could say that. I don't see your sister here." "Oh, she went to bed. Someone's bed, at least." She set her glass down, but took her bottle. "Think I'll do the same. Good night, General." "Chief. And that was a good idea you had, we're going to start implementing it tomorrow." Lin smiled at that, really smiled, and took her leave before any of the soldiers could recognize their commander. Activity around the camp had settled considerably as people retreated into their barracks, and Lin swung her bottle back and forth until she arrived at their quarters, a little building on the side of the senior officers' barracks. She slammed her foot into the ground before opening the door, not that it was really necessary, so wasn't nearly as quiet as she liked to think, and went inside when she sensed it was empty. Su returned almost an hour later, stumbling in on shaky legs. And almost collapsed on her bed with several contented sighs. "Firebenders, they've always got something to prove." Finally she seemed to notice her sister on the other bed in her night clothes, sketching in a small book, the Kaoliang forgotten on her nightstand. "Well, did you learn anything, my young apprentice?" She rolled her eyes. Young was not a word that had been directed at her for a long time. "I did, as a matter of fact. Whatever magic way you have with guys half your age isn't for me." I'm happy like this. And she was. For the first time in what truly felt like ages, she was happy. All Sue did was shrug and bury her head in her pillow, mumbling happily to herself while the phone rang. Bafong, whoa, slow down, Mei. How much? Well. Far be it from me to ever question your investigative skills again. Good work, Captain. You know what to do. Run him in, and see your mother in the morning about that promotion. Lin dropped the phone back on its hook with jittery hands. Her heart was pounding out of her chest again, but in a good way. She unstopped her Kaoliang and took a swig right from the bottle, and her nervous bouts of laughter were too much for even an exhausted Sue to ignore. What are you on about? I just gave the order to arrest the vice president, she said, still not quite believing her own shaky voice. Sue brought her face out of the pillow and sat up, brow furrowed. Then I'm guessing that wasn't a social call? Mei Kimura, former head of the council police. She resigned when Bolin and the others let Mako out to go traipsing around with the Avatar, but I signed her back on and into my office. Special investigator or something, a job that was easy to bury in the hierarchy where no one could find her. She's been digging up everything she could on Bolin since before I got knocked into that coma, and now she and her team have everything they need. Is that wise? Sue asked. He seemed pretty well connected. He's not the president, so sovereign immunity doesn't apply, and he can't fight the charges we'll have brought in the morning. Election fraud, extortion, receiving bribes, distributing bribes, any number of conspiracies, not to mention the unlawful dissolution of a valid government, Lin said, still a little giddy. Half of those connections flipped when they were offered deals, and Mei cowed the other half into silence. You'd almost think you had more fun tonight than I did. Sue got up, removed her diadem, and started changing for bed. Is that why you wanted to be away from the city? To insulate yourself from this. I didn't want anything thrown out on account of me and my prejudices. This had to be perfect. Well, Lin Bafong. Sue paused for a moment as she reached for a nightshirt. I never took you for such a smooth political operator. Lin set the Kaoliang on her nightstand and leaned back on her bed. Even noticing that everything was still maddeningly perky on Sue couldn't tarnish her good mood. Sometimes I surprise even myself. She shut the light, and as she laid awake in bed, Sue snoring nearby, she felt content. Doing the right thing for the right reasons was something that happened all too rarely for her, or so it felt. It seemed almost dreamlike, and it felt good. She felt good. Not because of Tenzin, or Iroh, or any random guy Sue threw at her, not even because of simple pettiness that she had a new criminal sitting in her jail. She felt good because of herself, and that was more than enough for her. Chapter 34, The Avatar and the Fire Lord. Kasai didn't merely shine in the early morning sun. It gleamed. Where Republic City's skyline had been impressive enough to Korra, Kasai's thrust up from the caldera that contained it as if to challenge the sky itself for unquestioned supremacy. Even from a distance, towers formed what seemed like a steady silhouette that took on the shape of an upturned blade, cutting into the clouds drifting lazily overhead. The architects and city planners must have enjoyed creating such an effect. The rising sun struck so much metal and glass on the skyscrapers that it cast a dazzling show of light all over the lower buildings, sure to rouse anyone who wasn't already awake. It's amazing, Kuvira said, still rubbing the sleep from her eyes. Korra nodded, leaning back into her on the bench. Not something we can let fall apart. Millions of people live here. Basing SE was bad enough, I can't let that happen again. We won't. Her hand idly wound its way through Korra's hair, gently working out the knots that she usually gave up on. As sure as Kuvira sounded, the words never quite worked their way to her heart like their whispered exchanges of I love you when they bedded down at night. It would only take one well-aimed dagger, one perfectly timed combustion blast, and it would be over. She had never met the woman, and thought for years that they would come together under very different circumstances, but she found herself wishing desperately that Fire Lord Izumi would have a better life expectancy than the last Earth Queen. The current Earth Queen, on the other hand, was very much alive, and squeezed her tighter before planting a light kiss on her neck. Korra knew it felt good, but it hit a hollowness in her chest, gnawing at her ever since they set out from Republic City. She dreaded the dark, she dreaded sleeping, she dreaded the same persistent nightmares cycling through night after night like a terrible mover reel. Telling her that she had to die, that she was the last petal of the Red Lotus, that her friends would hunt her down with the same zeal with which she pursued Zahir and Pili. I don't want to die, she wanted to say. Please don't let me die. Of course she couldn't say that, couldn't put that on Kuvira or Asami or even Mako. She was their avatar. It fell to her to protect them, not the other way around. And if that meant dying, then that would be what it meant. I love you, she finished, and she rose with Kuvira's sharp intake of breath. Please forgive me if I have to leave this world. I love you, too. Kuvira nuzzled her neck, and though she didn't look back from the helm, Korra saw Asami stiffen slightly. Things were so much simpler when all she had to do was train. We're almost at Kasai, Asami said, her voice thick. Someone should wake up Mako. I'm awake, I'm out. Damn it. He struck his head on the cabin ceiling as he did every morning, and Korra bit back a laugh. It wasn't all gloom in their little ship. You couldn't build in a little more headroom, Asami. We're the same height, and I never hit my head. Mako grumbled and climbed down before disappearing into the shower. Korra left breakfast to him. She still didn't trust herself not to mangle their food without his guidance, and he managed to whip up a small plate of baizai that they all picked at while Asami guided them into the Fire Nation capital. The massive spires didn't have quite the same effect up close, Korra thought. It was as if she were only looking at a very small portion of a painting, and the perspective was all off. Where from a distance the towers formed a beautiful blade cutting through the air, up close they were garish sentinels that lacked all scale and towered cruelly over the rest of the city. The crown jewel of the Fire Nation, Asami said, tuning the radio to the proper frequency. Kasai. She pronounced it the same way that Kuvira did, accentuating the last two letters while Korra and Mako ran through the name more quickly. A few prickles of familiarity needled up Korra's spine as she looked out the window, and Asami spoke with the air traffic control. That wasn't right. She had never been to Kasai. A few small villages on the eastern islands for supplies or things they couldn't make themselves, but never Kasai. Zahir would have had an aneurysm if she had ever suggested it. The thought brought a mirthless smile to her lips. Then why does it seem so familiar? After several minutes of Asami throwing around numbers and jargon that she didn't understand, they were finally given a mooring point well away from the palace. Korra frowned. They could have identified themselves as a diplomatic flight, but she had no idea how far or how deep the roots of the Red Lotus extended. Kuvira hid her crown in her bag and quickly undid her braid, letting her hair spill over her shoulders to at least change that slight bit of her appearance. Korra pulled a sleeve over her scarred arm, Asami put her own hair into a high, tight ponytail, and Mako at least made the effort to look as casual and forgettable as possible. The pepper came down softly over the tarmac. Korra reflected on how graceful their airship was when its rotors weren't failing. Rather than shooting tethers out to burrow into the ground, Asami extended them slowly so a pair of workers could attach the cables to the back of a small truck that brought them into just the right position for docking. They reeled in by small degrees until the gangplank could rest on the ground. When they disembarked, Asami pushed away the stack of documents one of the workers offered to her and pressed a large stack of yuans into his hand, as well as his colleagues. We were never here, you don't know who owns this airship, it came in the night and the graveyard crew lost the paperwork. Understand? What airship? One of them asked, counting the money with poorly restrained glee. Asami smiled and they made their way into the terminal. Korra had wanted to wear a hood, but they talked her out of it. Wearing one on a hot, late summer day would only bring more attention, Mako had said. She settled for letting her wolf tail out and having her hair fall loose over her head to conceal the shaved-down sides. Kuvira gave her hand a comforting squeeze while Mako retrieved a city map from a nearby kiosk. It's about an hour's walk to the palace, he said, holding up the map. There's mass transit, but that involves a lot of sitting around and maybe getting noticed. Korra shook her head. We'll walk. Good chance to stretch our legs, anyway. And you should change. Mako pointed at her whole outfit. You stick out in that getup. She put a hand over her stomach, running some of the fabric between her thumb and first finger. Nothing interested her less than bearing her midriff in a local outfit and putting all her scars on display. These were her clothes, clothes Asami had given her. No. Suit yourself. We should get going before someone sees us, then. You three don't exactly blend. On that issue, Korra couldn't fight him. She and Kuvira were both powerfully built, very noticeably so in their snug clothing, and Asami was tall and striking. How Mako came to be leading them out of the terminal and onto the street, she didn't know. He moved with rare aplomb while scouting the sidewalks, moving them through alleys when he deemed it appropriate, and generally doing everything in his power to get three very recognizable women around a very crowded city without anyone noticing them. Even more amazingly to Korra, he did it all without so much as a grumble, only a quiet confidence. "You're good at this," she said when he returned to the entrance of the alley he left them in. "Growing up on the street, you learn a few things." Mako waved them forward when he was satisfied they wouldn't draw any attention on the sidewalk. "It's easy not to be noticed, if you know how." Korra felt a headache coming on as they went through an older district of the city, one left untouched by the rapid march into modernity, along with a painful tension in the rest of her body. Her period had stopped more than a week ago, that couldn't have been it, but something still pricked at her in the same way that familiarity chilled its way through her when they first approached Kasai. She put a hand on her unscarred temple and almost tripped over a bit of cobblestone. "You okay?" Kuvira asked, reaching out to steady her. "Fine." It wasn't true. A small lie, but one that still stung through her. She had never lied to Kuvira, she realized. Never dabbled in honeying mutual deception as she had with Asami when they were in Republic City. It didn't feel good. Just my head. Walking around with one woman clutching at her head wasn't good for staying unnoticed, Mako reasoned, and he put them on a bench while he got some water from a store nearby. Asami put a hand on her shoulder, as Kuvira was doing on her opposite side. "Do you think it's from your injuries?" she asked. "Having a piece of shrapnel forced into your skull at high speed can't be good." "No, that was true, at least. It's not the same kind of pain. That's a hot, sharp sting, pressing down on the top of my eye. This is throbbing. All over. Throbbing and pounding everywhere in my head like when I thought you were dead and I was ready to burn the world to ashes. Like when I'm forced into the avatar state," she finished. Not a lie, Korra told herself. Not really. Hiding so much of herself behind placating words, assurances accompanied by weak smiles flashed at the people who cared about her, make her feel uncomfortably like a rat. Like one of the hypothetical sleazy politicians Zahir concocted who were only too happy to live down to the expectations he planted in her head. She wished so badly she could be honest. Wished she could share her fears. "This fight is going to kill me. I'm going to die destroying the Red Lotus." But Asami was still reconciling ideology with reality and Kuvira had the shambles of an entire nation to piece back together. The fears and terrors of a middling avatar were minor in comparison. A cup of water came over her shoulder. "Here," Mako said, also dropping a candy bar in her lap from behind. "They made me buy something before they'd give me the water." "Thank you." She took long, deep gulps and worked through the chocolate in 4 quick bites. The throbbing persisted. "Hopefully it'll work, let's keep going. We can take a quick break, Korra. The rest of us lose a bit of legitimacy if we barge into the Fire Lord's office and you're passed out. There's an alley there we can wait in." No, her voice was solid, resolute. She stood up, and Asami and Kuvira followed. "We don't have the luxury of time. You didn't see Ba Sing Se, Mako. I can only imagine what kind of hell Peely could rain down if she blew up the supports for those skyscrapers." "You haven't talked about her," Kuvira said. "And no one's ever dealt with what you've said she can do. Not for almost 80 years, anyway." "I saw it," Asami said, shivering despite the heat. "On Air Temple Island. She blew away 10 Equalists and blasted through a huge rock like it was nothing." Korra shrugged. "She was my friend when they first took me. Pretended to be, anyway. She made my clothes and taught me to read. I felt so guilty about burning down my house, and she taught me how to control fire. How to make lightning. I never could pick up combustion bending, though. Avatar or not, I think that's something you're born with." She paused and realized they were all looking at her. "But you meant her actual abilities, didn't you?" "It's hard to explain. It's just focusing chi through the tattoo and light chakra at her forehead. Hit her there, and it won't work. She'll have to use regular fire bending. We have to get metal or something similar around her forehead and then chi block her. I can do that. But she can curve the blasts, and they're hard to see. I should be the one to fight her. Her head felt a little better as she talked. Mako glanced back while they waited at an intersection. What, and take all the glory for yourself. We're more than your cabin crew, Korra. Let us help. Korra attributed the shift in his attitude to whatever Kuvira had said to him as they were leaving Sci-Fi, and while she knew he was only joking in his usual way, his words still galled her. There was no glory to win, no victories to hail. They were hunting people and probably going to die in the attempt. She didn't have the heart to respond. It figured that Mako would start acting like a decent person only for him to end up in the line of fire with her. Korra only gave him a non-committal hum in response while they walked through the increasingly old streets. The skyscrapers cast massive shadows as the morning went on, looming high and far as they rounded the last corner. An enormous gated estate stood atop a slight hill, with 3 smaller buildings surrounding a tall, almost spindly central tower. Parts of it had obviously been restored, but care had been taken to preserve the palace as it had been since before anyone could recall. And then Korra remembered. Each step she took toward the gate was not her own. First it was the simple boot of an air nomad, then the gilded slipper of Fire Nation nobility. Visions rudely crowded her sight, showing her people on the street in obviously antiquated clothing who weren't really there. She knew they weren't there, and yet they felt as real as the scars on her body or the air in her lungs. The painful throbbing in her head returned with a vengeance, crowding out her own thoughts. Korra grimaced and tried to stay steady as they approached the main guard post. "Let me handle this one," Kuvira said, tying back her hair and reluctantly slipping on her crown. She only got snippets of the conversation while her head swam. "Didn't they get a new queen?" someone asked. A guard. "Yeah. Get that newspaper." Another guard. "She does look a lot like the Earth Queen." "Because I am the Earth Queen." Exasperation had snuck into Kuvira's usual low, measured voice. Korra realized what was happening. She saw Fire Lords she didn't know from eyes that were not her own. "Get out," she muttered, prompting Mako and Asami to look back at her while she held her head in her hands, shaking it back and forth like she was trying to get a bit of water out of her ear. "You all want to waltz in now? Get out, get out." The words turned to ashes in her mouth, and she struck her head against the wall encircling the palace. A stitch burst, and blood dripped down her cheek as she hit her head again and again. Bright white light overtook her vision, and she felt the crackle of electricity around her before the darkness. Inconceivable loss, tentative hope for the future Aang. His cheerfulness infected as much as his sorrow. A memory of bending pure energy, pure chi, not once but twice, swirled away as quickly as it had surfaced. She had the most lessons about him, few of them good. Betrayal, failure. Roku. Korra watched through him as his friend laid the world low and made plans to burn away what parts wouldn't submit. His visage was ugly, twisted. Zahir had never encouraged any admiration of him, after all. Steely will, some kind of painful incongruence she couldn't place. Kyoshi, maybe. Korra had never learned much about her. Ruinous apathy and carving out her own city-state had earned her no great place in the Red Lotus lessons. Grief, regret, Kuruk, certainly. The pain of lost love struck poignantly at her heart, as did the haunting thoughts of what could have been. Another avatar that Zahir had gone to great lengths to lambast. Serenity, solemn duty. Yang Chen. The only avatar for whom Zahir accorded some measure of respect, and then begrudgingly. All of them, dozens of faces where only a few looked familiar, swirled in her mind, all speaking at once. Korra just wanted it to end. She wanted her thoughts, her face, her friends. "Rava," she said weakly, calling out to the void. "Please, please make it stop." It stopped. She gasped as she awoke, trying to sit up despite the rush of blood to her head. Kuvira sat at her side, hair once more in its sleek braid, and put a hand on her shoulder to stop her from getting up too quickly. "Easy, easy. I know you said you were tired of waking up in hospitals. How's prison sound?" "What?" Korra looked around. She, Kuvira and Asami were in a large cell, while Mako was by his lonesome across the hall. I keep getting thrown in jail because of you. She ignored him and looked around the cell. There were 3 cots including the one she was sitting on, plus a sink and a toilet. Nothing else. She felt at the floor with her bare feet. This is stone. Those bars aren't platinum. Why are we still in here? She asked, turning to Kuvira. I did think of that, Kuvira said, fixing Korra's hair so that it hung behind her ear the way she liked. And then I thought that the Fire Lord might not be very amenable to listening to 4 escapees forcing their way into her office. Why does everyone think I'm not going to knock? It was the best attempt at humor she could muster just then, but a loud, dangerous voice rang out from somewhere down the hall. You did what? It was standard procedure, Your Highness, we didn't know. Mako reflexively cringed at the sound of a hand singing across a cheek. Enough. Give me the keys and wait here. I'm not done with either of you. There was a single set of rushed footsteps down what sounded like stairs, and soft muttering until a woman stepped into view of their cells. She didn't look that much older than any of them, maybe 30 if that, and she wore a simple pantsuit while a bit of gold in the shape of a flame adorned her top knot. The sharp features of her face looked remarkably like Iroh in the brief time Korra had met him. Her glower softened as she worked a key into their cell door, and she took a step back while it slid open. Avatar Korra. Your Majesty. Miss Sato. She looked over her shoulder. Mr. Han. I'm terribly sorry about this mess. You know who we are? Mako asked, clearly more impressed that someone actually knew who he was. I do, the woman said, unlocking his cell. I'm the director of our intelligence service, it behooves me to know these things. Your antics in Sci-Fi didn't go unnoticed, despite how quickly you left. And you knew we were coming here? Asami asked. I doubted you were on your way to Ember Island. Although it's lovely this time of year, you should visit if you have the chance. Korra looked at her, but saw no malice in her eyes, only fatigue, and maybe a bit of curiosity. Of course, Zahir never had malice in his eyes, either. I'm afraid you have us at a disadvantage, then. This is Princess Isola, Kuvira said, giving her a courteous nod. She returned a small bow. Crown Princess actually, Your Majesty. Mako laughed, though none of them could tell why. Hat trick, he mumbled, and fell silent again. I thought Prince Iroh was next in line for the throne. Kuvira asked. General Iroh first wore any claim to the throne when he began serving in a foreign military. I believe you have a similar law. Not to mention getting engaged to an Earth Kingdom princess. Your cousin, I believe. Yin. Pleasant enough woman. Now who was banging their head on the fence around my house? Korra could feel her face flushing as her hand went to a fresh bandage on her temple. Sorry. I don't know what came over me. She had an inkling, but she didn't have nearly as many compunctions about lying to a woman she just met as she did about lying to her friends. But we need to speak with the Fire Lord right away. How long have we been in here? About 2 hours, Mako said, stepping out of his cell. My mother tends to be busy in the middle of the day, but I'm sure she can make time for the Avatar and the Earth Queen. Isola's small half-smile faltered. This is about the Red Lotus. She nodded, still reeling from a bit of dizziness. Isola beckoned them out of their cell and led them up a short flight of stairs, where the 2 palace guards from the gate were still standing stock still, breaths catching in their throats when they caught sight of Isola. They retrieved their things, with the noticeable exception of a certain rose gold circlet, safely stowed in a case behind a desk. My crown, please, Kuvira said dryly. The guards didn't move until Isola nodded, and then they nearly climbed over one another to return it. We're very sorry, Your Majesty, one of them said. Isola scoffed. You can be sorry while you're guarding our embassy in the Northern Water Tribe, and count yourself lucky you didn't start a war. Ladies, Mako. My car is waiting. Isola brought them to a jet-black limousine with small Fire Nation flags on either side of the hood. She ushered them into the back before tapping on the partition to signal the driver, and they were off. Your Highness, about the Red Lotus, Korra began, but she put a hand up. Save your speeches for my mother, Avatar. You don't have to convince me. They need to die. Oh. That seemed rather easy, although it unsettled her that such a high-ranking government official was so casual about sanctioning the deaths of 2 people. I heard a different answer from the Fire Lord. She nodded, frowning, and looking out the darkened window. The Diet won't sanction any assassinations because they need to be re-elected, and my mother is a very idealistic woman. More like my grandfather than she'll care to admit, and not in a good way. She doesn't like being involved in the wet work that keeps the country stable, but I will keep my family safe, no matter how many nationals I have to kill. Isola sighed at the thought. Everyone seems to think I'm some awful phantom of my great-aunt, but if that's the price I pay for being the only pragmatic member of my family, then so be it. She wants to go ahead with this stupid demonstration tomorrow that was a nightmare to secure in the first place. She may as well walk into a bear trap. Her fingers tapped rhythmically on the window until she reached under her seat and produced 2 folders, handing one to Cora and one to Kuvira. They're dossiers, if you're interested. I got the sense from your speech that they weren't always totally honest with you. Cora looked over the reports, Zahir's in her lap, Peely's and Kuvira's next to her. They had been busy over the years, it seemed. Bombings, assassinations of minor government functionaries on the Eastern Islands, an attempt to steal one of the copies of the nation's constitution, to say nothing of the many papers she didn't look through. These other dossiers. Ghazan and Minghua. Can I close their cases? Isola asked, holding up 2 more folders. I killed Minghua. Asami killed Ghazan. Good. No great loss. Isola looked approvingly at Asami before burning the dossiers to ashes in her hand. Oh, and I was sorry to hear about your brother's troubles, Mr. Han. Mako's fine, Your Highness. Wait. What? She cocked her head and looked at him for a long moment, watching him with a cool, impassive gaze. Finally, her half-smile returned, but it was a politician's smile to Cora, empty, all show. They arrested him last night, pending trial. Doesn't that airship of yours have a radio? Bolin. All the color drained from his face, and he recoiled from her words as if they struck him in the gut. But, why? Who? The police, I assume. We've been asking the very same questions all morning, but the United Republic's intelligence service got a new director at almost the same time. She took a small piece of paper from her sleeve, looked it over, and then burned that as well. Maybe one of you knows her, Mei Kimura. Mako groaned. Anyway. She isn't very keen on sharing any details at the moment. It'd sound like a coup, but your president is safe and sound while Bolin's sitting in jail, Isola said, as casual as if she were talking about the weather. Cora caught her gaze and felt an uncomfortable chill run down her spine, stopping midway, near her heart. It's not a threat to us, at any rate. I care about what happens inside our borders, and that hasn't included the United Republic for a long time. No, if I had to look for something to be wary of, it'd be you. Me? Cora asked, shifting in her seat. Isola remained perfectly still, watching with the same disinterested look. What are you talking about? If I was the paranoid type, and I am, it comes with the territory. I wouldn't put a very long con past you. You're about to have the Earth Queen and the Fire Lord in the same room at the same time. A windfall like that would be well worth the effort, no. You. Cora's fists tightened up before Kuvira put a hand on her shoulder. There have been more than enough chances for an assassination. I trust Cora with my life, she said, putting the hard, royal edge on her voice again. Isola gave them a dismissive wave of her hand. Yes, I've seen the papers. So very smitten with each other. She grimaced, and Asami sat on her hands, bumping Mako with her elbow as she did. Please spare me any earnest attempts to prove how in love you really are. I've just had lunch. I doubt you would have gone through all this trouble for nothing more than a few quick kills, anyway. I'm taking you to see my mother, aren't I? Her expression softened the slightest bit, and Cora calmed down. The ache in her head was back, the smooth, sharp voice running over her mind like a knife. Is this always how you make conversation? The limo rolled onto the palace grounds. My little sister says I have a morbid sense of humor, too. I apologize if I touched a nerve, Avatar Cora. Most of my day is spent thinking up worst-case scenarios and finding ways to recover from them. She bristled, but leaned into Kuvira rather than saying anything. Korra wasn't sure she liked the Fire Nation government much. Everything was bright and terribly warm inside the palace, where the walls were covered in red and gold lacquer with maps and murals dotted throughout. No one so much as looked askance at them, with Isola leading the way, and indeed did everything they could to scramble out of her path. All the while, Korra found herself taking a tentative step down the wrong hallway or into another room for no other reason than she felt like she remembered where she was going. "Whichever one of you is doing this, get out of my head." They came to the largest set of doors, enormous slabs of mahogany stained a deep and imposing red. Gold inlay served as handles, though none of them could imagine what kind of creature could use such things. Isola showed them through a much more sensibly sized door off to the side, and then they were in the throne room. Hot, searing blades of remembrance slashed at Korra, but she endured, letting them wash over her as Kuvira's hand found the small of her back. She looked at the queen and smiled before turning to the cavernous space before them. Where Korra remembered a curtain of fire burning brightly to shroud the throne itself, which sat empty, there were a few tasteful lamps flanking a much more sensible desk with a very harried, middle-aged woman sitting behind it. She glanced up as the door shut, and her focused look softened in an instant. "Isola. Mother." She waved them forward, and Korra's group followed her through the room. "I brought friends." She went around the desk and met them in the middle of the room, where there were a few chairs and couches arranged for small meetings, and hugged Isola tightly. "Avatar Korra, Queen Kuvira, Asami Sato, Mako Han. May I present Fire Lord Izumi." A memory one of Ain's, she supposed hit her hard, an image of a much younger woman with a long flow of shining black hair and an admiring, embarrassed look hidden behind thick glasses. It faded as soon as it appeared, and the real Izumi remained standing before her. Most of her hair had grayed, with only a few wisps of black remaining, and the frame of her glasses was different. It was still her, though. The same sharp cheekbones, the same restrained look in her eye. Just a little older. They all bowed, and Izumi followed suit. "Your Majesty," Korra mumbled. The words still felt strange on her tongue, no matter how many times she teased Kuvira with them. They were words she thought she would only ever use mockingly, something pithy to say in her teenage daydreams in the seconds before wiping out a world leader. But now the words were real, and as strange as they might have been, there was no rancor behind them, no dripping venom. Only fatigue. She was so tired. "Avatar Korra. Queen Kuvira." She nodded at Asami and Mako as well before they all took seats on the couches. Isola remained standing, watching Korra without making it terribly obvious. "Guess she still doesn't trust me. I was sorry to hear about your family, Your Majesty. And your city. We'll have to discuss restorative aid soon, I'm sure." "Hey, are these rice cakes?" Mako asked, looking in a container on the table between the couches. Izumi nodded. "Please, help yourself." "My city is Zaofu, ma'am," Kuvira said in her cool, low, measured tones while Mako and Asami split the rice cakes. "But any help the Fire Nation could provide would be more than welcome and repaid in full. General Iroha's brigade will only be able to do so much, I'm afraid, and to hear Princess Isola tell it, the United Republic is less than reliable at the moment." "Iroha's leading that force?" Izumi asked, leaning forward in her seat, abandoning some of her stately dignity. "You knew that, Mother. I told you 2 weeks ago. He always was a pig for the glory. Would have marched there barefoot day and night if Yin asked him to." The mention of her future daughter-in-law brought a cool expression back to Izumi's face. "Yes. Well. You have my assurances that he'll perform admirably, Your Majesty. Iroha was never one to do anything in half measures. Although I'm sure you've come here in secret." "A badly kept secret," Isola said, smirking until she withered under her mother's glare. "Do not interrupt me. As I was saying, I assume that the Avatar is the one actually making the visit, and she isn't only here as your window dressing." There was a sharpness to her words, but then the faintest smile tugged at the corner of her mouth, and Korra breathed a sigh of relief. At least they didn't have that working against them. Tenzin had already been less than approving, and nearly half the newspapers in Republic City had seemed more interested in voyeuristic tut-tutaying than in reporting the disaster in Ba Sing Se. Neither of them had elected positions, which gave them the luxury of some small apathy, but seeing the hit pieces in the papers piled up by Kuvira's bed in the hospital still stung. She pushed it out of her mind. There were more important things to focus on. "I'm sure you know why I came," Cora said finally, trying to measure her words in the way that Kuvira did with such little effort. "And with all due respect, destroying what's left of the Red Lotus isn't up to the Diet, or even you. They won't stop until you and every other world leader is dead, or they are. Most of what's left of the Red Lotus. There's still me." Whatever inkling of a smile Izumi had died away as she steepled her hands in her chair. "You aren't above the law here, Avatar Korra. Whatever transpired in the Southern Water Tribe or the Earth Kingdom, murder is murder. This is even beyond that. You're asking me to condone the assassinations of 2 of my own citizens." "2 terrorists, Mother," Isola said, her voice plaintive and pleading. "Do you know what they did to Chief Unalaq?" Korra asked, frustration working into her tone. "To Queen Hoting and the rest of the Earth Kingdom royal family? Their heads were decoration for spikes by the time we got to Ba Sing Se." Kuvira nodded, but kept her voice dispassionate, a level-headed contrast to an exasperated Avatar. "A single man laid half the city to ruin in a matter of days, and so severely that I've had to recall what's left of my government to Zaofu. It may have to become the permanent capital. While I can't say that I've ever had any strong feelings on the Fire Nation, I don't want that to happen to Kasai, or any other city. Millions of people live here." Izumi sighed deeply and removed her glasses, placing them in her lap. "Korra, Kuvira," she began, addressing them so informally that Asami almost choked on a rice cake. "I realize that I'm not as young as either of you anymore, but I'm not deaf. I can hear you perfectly well. Our reports from Ba Sing Se were horrific. I know that this is a very clear, very present threat to myself, my government, and my country, and I would like nothing more than to be rid of this Zahir and Pili once and for all." For a moment Korra hoped they had gotten through to her, and even Isola looked optimistic. "But I'm not above the law." Korra deflated somewhat while Isola shook with impotent frustration. "I don't have the power to decide who should live and who should die. My great-great-grandfather thought he had that power, and he would have burned the world if he could have lorded over the cinders afterward. Because of him I could have counted the number of airbenders in the whole world on one hand, until a few months ago." She looked at Asami, who was still trying to quietly dislodge a piece of rice cake from her throat. Mako jabbed her with his elbow until she noticed all the attention in the room was on her, and then she turned a rather bright shade of red. It almost matched the room, Korra thought. Isola seemed to get some of her wherewithal back in the meantime. "Mother, if you won't sanction this as a matter of record, you will not have the Intelligence Directorate defy this office." Lightning crackled through her voice, and a few sparks flew from her fingertips before she reined herself in. "I know you do the unpleasant, necessary things, Isola. The difficult things. I'm asking you to do a difficult thing now and stop, honey." Isola bit back tears with such force that a line of blood trickled from where her teeth pierced her lip. "You're asking me to let you walk around with a target on your back," she said thickly. "You and grandfather, do you really think your honor or your ideals are so much more important than your country having a leader they trust and love? Is it more important than Iroh and Hanako and I having our mother? Are you so high-minded that we mean so little to you?" She got up faster than Korra would have thought possible and pulled her daughter into a hug. "You mean everything to me?" Isola did her best, but a few tears dripped and hit her mother's suit. Korra shifted uncomfortably with the others, unsure if they should have been present for such a personal, private display. They remembered they weren't alone after a minute, mercifully enough, and all of them looked pointedly away while the princess and the Fire Lord collected themselves. "I realize that I don't have a station or title or anything like that, but I do have a suggestion," Asami said, and they all turned to her again. Princess Isola mentioned some kind of demonstration on the ride over here that seemed to be a sticking point. "Is it something that's vitally necessary for you to attend, Your Majesty?" "That's complicated, Miss Sato," Izumi said before clearing her throat. "Explaining the twisted state of our national politics would take the better part of the day and is very likely beyond the scope of my abilities, so I'll sum it up as best I can. My executive branch of the government is constantly struggling with the Diet for a greater deal of control. Budgets, authority on things not specifically outlined in our constitution, things like that. Two boards of directors trying to outmaneuver one another for power over a single company, if you like. As it stands, the Diet isn't quite as scared of me as they were of my father when he established the system. Asami nodded, and Mako and Kuvira followed along as well. Trying to keep up only made Korra like Fire Nation politics less and less. You're wondering how that comes back around to your question, I'm sure. Tomorrow happens to be the convergence of two important holidays, one Fire Nation and one Air Nation that we observe in memoriam. I could absolutely come down with a terrible chest cold tomorrow and stay in bed all day. I could decide to just not go to the fire-bending demonstration at all. My father won't drag me there by my ear, again, but it means giving the Diet more ammunition to use against me. I rather like having the power to help all of my people, not only the ones who own those skyscrapers and donate to election campaigns. We aren't here to upheave the balance of your government, ma'am, Kuvira said, putting a hand on Korra's knee and squeezing. Her head still hurt terribly, and she was more than happy to let the others do the talking. And it sounds like you're going to this demonstration, despite any objections that might be raised. Izumi nodded, and Isola wiped her eyes dry. You think this threat is actionable, Korra? Kuvira asked. Yeah. Tomorrow's the day of remembrance over the war and falls on the same day as the Air Nomad calendar's midpoint. Zahir won't miss the opportunity to make a statement like that. Then let us provide some extra security, and if anything does happen, we'll do our best to take them alive. You have my word. She waited for a response while Izumi studied her. They were equals, at least on paper, but the fingers digging into her knee told Korra that Kuvira was fighting to keep her nerves down. You're the Earth Queen, Izumi said, incredulous. You guarding me would send an interesting message, to say the least. I'm not being vain when I tell you that I'm the best metal bender you'll ever meet. Not to mention our air-bending chi-blocking expert, Master Lightning Bender, and the Avatar. If you think there would be political ramifications, don't announce anything. The palace guards didn't even know who I was when I was right in front of them, and Mako and Asami can certainly blend in. Please. We already have one country in shambles and another on the edge, we can't lose the Fire Nation as well. You're good at this, you know, Izumi said with a wry smile. Seems to me you'll make an excellent queen. Very well. We can keep up the low profile you all tried so admirably to maintain for as long as we need. Isola can show you to your quarters until we have all the information about tomorrow. I trust 3 rooms will be sufficient. Korra felt her face flush and saw something flash on Asami's face, gone as quickly as it had come. Yes, that will be fine, thank you, Kuvira said, also going red under the collar. They filed back out while Izumi returned to her desk, and Korra pinched the bridge of her nose. It would have been hard enough to protect her if she wasn't walking into a trap, she said when the door was securely closed behind her. Isola gave an affirmative hum before directing them down another corridor. Nothing about it tugged at Korra's sense of familiarity, and so she was able to keep up. All the proclamations and honor in the world won't be worth anything if she's killed. If you get to these people first, they're all yours. If my staff finds them, I'll take whatever rebukes I get for killing them. They can yank me out of the line of succession and give Hanako the throne, I'm not going to let them kill my mother. She didn't know whether she preferred to find Zahir first or let the princess have him. If it came to that, he had to die, principles or no principles. Banishment from the Fire Nation seemed like a small price to pay for keeping it intact. There was an odd lack of snark back there, Mako, Korra said. Just thinking about my brother. He's in jail and I'm not, this has never happened before. I hope he's okay. That was half true, he was in some legal limbo between probation and a work release, but it was leaps and bounds better than being confined to a cell, she supposed. She wanted to tell him that he would be fine and find some way to weasel out of it, but somehow it didn't seem like it would have the intended effect. Instead she nodded, awash in her own thoughts. They would be there. Korra was sure of that. The Fire Lord and the Crown Princess in the same place would be too tempting a target for Zahir to ignore, to say nothing of the Earth Queen and the Avatar. She had half a mind to keep Mako and Asami from going, if only to minimize the collateral damage that was sure to ensue, but they would fight to be there, she knew. Her friends wouldn't abandon her, even if she pleaded. And then they'll kill me, too. The last petal of the red lotus. She shook her head clear and walked right into Asami's back, jumping back when she saw they had stopped so that Isola could throw open the door to one of the guest rooms. Sorry. Wait, this is a spare bedroom. She thought the Bafong estate had been opulent, but the back wing of the palace's guest quarters was lavish beyond anything Cora ever dreamed possible. Isola shrugged while Cora stepped inside, looking around at more empty space than she had ever seen in a bedroom. The room itself was nearly as big as her house had been, to say nothing of the other cramped accommodations she was used to. Everything was slightly darkened and lit by small sconces along the wall, with two of them flanking an enormous bed. You could fit all of us on that thing. I really don't care to know what sleeping arrangements you're planning, Isola said while she pointed out two more doors on the opposite side of the hallway. Those are the other rooms. You can use the phones inside to order whatever you'd like from the kitchens. My staff might have more information about your brother now, Mako. If you'd like to follow me. Is something wrong? The food from the kitchens smelled sumptuous, was expertly arranged, and came in such large servings that two people could have had their fill from each plate. Still, Cora only picked idly at it with her chopsticks, moving the food around more than eating it. Her head had finally stopped aching, but memories of the palace from past lives continued to seep into her mind, showing her people who weren't really there, making her remember events centuries past as if they were only hours old. Cora looked at Asami across the table, and then to Kuvira next to her. She wasn't aware of who had asked the question, only that it was one of them. There was no one else in the bedroom, after all. Everything is wrong, she wanted to say. The sanctity of my mind is under attack and I can't see myself coming out of this mess alive. There was no use in continuing to lie, she decided. If she could fall useless at an inopportune moment, they needed to know. She didn't want them being put in danger because of her. My past lives are finally breaking through, Cora said, spearing a dumpling she had no intention of eating. Asami cocked her head. You don't sound very happy about it. They're not staying put. Every few minutes I want to fix some face paint that isn't there or adjust a kimono I'm not wearing. I get these shots of pain in my feet because my boots suddenly aren't big enough. Sounds like Kyoshi, Kuvira said. I'm seeing things that aren't there, she admitted, despising the feeling of weakness washing over her. They're memories of this place. It's like every Dem avatar had to make a pilgrimage here or something. Your two immediate predecessors were here a lot. The look of concern never faltered from Asami's face while she spoke. Roku grew up here as a courtier, and Aang visited Lord Zuko often. I'm sure the others met with Fire Lords every now and then. I think one of them was the Fire Lord. Cora nodded, resting her hand under her chin. I can tell what's happening now and what isn't after a few seconds, because the clothing in the memories is ridiculous, but it feels so real for that first instant. I thought there was a chambermaid coming into the room before I realized it was something Kyoshi was remembering. She wanted to laugh despite herself. All those years of trying to get in touch with my past lives, now it's like they want to make up for lost time and they're climbing over my memories and thoughts to do it. A hand rested lightly on her shoulder. Kuvira's thumb moved over the end of her collarbone in an attempt to comfort her, and Cora wished desperately that it did more to put her at ease. You'll get it under control. If anyone can figure it out, it's you. Nothing like that ever happens to either of you, does it? Remembering things you never learned, feeling like new places are familiar for no reason. I'm pretty sure that only comes with the Avatar spirit, Asami said. Right. Infected with the memories and feelings of others, crowded out of her own mind that was only for her. Cora stood up and dropped her napkin onto her plate. She wasn't going to eat any more, anyway. I'm going to take a little walk. Maybe try and get more of the memories out so they don't bother me later. She felt their gazes on her as she slipped out of the bedroom and back into the hall. A guard Isola had posted there for them straightened up a bit, but she ignored him and started down the corridor, opposite from the way they had come hours prior. The insistence on architectural uniformity was beginning to confuse her, as every hallway looked much like the one before it. She knew there was an onyx inlay on the door to her room, but beyond that everything else was so similar that she wondered how anyone found anything in the palace. Finally, she took a corner a bit too tightly and ran right into someone. Ah, sorry, I'm Mako. His hair was disheveled, his shirt was on inside out, and there was an unmistakable scent about him, but it was Mako, all right. He pointedly avoided her gaze, instead becoming quite taken with the design on the ceiling. Korra. Should I even ask? I guess that depends on whether or not you want the answer, he said with a shrug. Korra rubbed the back of her neck and steeled herself for the inevitable answer. You're still in my custody, I should know where you are. Are we really keeping up that charade? Mako asked. Korra crossed her arms. Fine, fine. The princess was upset about her mother, she had some frustration she wanted to get off her chest. And you wanted to get off, she said, exasperated. In my defense, I made sure she did, too. She felt like slumming it, that doesn't mean I'm selfish. Korra rolled her eyes and waited until a pair of guards passed to speak again. I thought you'd be more interested in her mother, based on what I've heard, don't you ever get tired of sticking that thing everywhere? Fire. Nation. Crown. Princess, he said, halting at every word as if she were having trouble hearing. That's a no, if you couldn't tell. Besides, you're one to talk. You're dating the Earth Queen, not to mention whatever you had with Asami. I assumed the only reason you didn't jump on me too was because you don't bend that way. Yeah, that's the reason, Korra muttered, her voice thick with sarcasm. Look, I don't need an international incident on my hands in 9 months, so just keep it in your pants, will you? Oh, you don't have to worry about that. But I'll be a good little monk because you asked so nicely. I need a shower and some sleep, anyway. He slipped past her, but Korra grabbed his arm. Wait. Not the best time to prove you do bend that way, Korra. One of these days I'm going to smack that smirk right off your face. No, I need your help with something. Can you show me how to get a call down to the Southern Water Tribe? I tried the number my parents gave me, but it only goes to some tailor near the harbor. Yeah, come on. She followed Mako back down the halls that he could somehow navigate, back to their rooms. He went into his quarters, took the little slip of paper with the number Korra offered, and picked up the phone on his nightstand. You dialed the exchange for the Southern Water Tribe, right? The what? You dial 0, then 5, and then the number here. All right, it's ringing. Talk to your folks. Mako gave her the handset and set his backpack up on his bed to look through it. The ringing cut off abruptly, and a woman's tired voice answered her. Hello? Who's calling? Mom. Korra. The fatigue melted away in an instant. Korra, are you okay? Is something wrong? No, I'm okay, Mom. We're in the Fire Nation, at the palace. I'm going to put a stop to this Red Lotus threat. Mako stripped off his shirt to turn it inside out, and Korra gave him a sidelong glance while she bit her lip. Don't bend that way, idiot. Oh, my sweet baby, hold on, let me wake up your father. I didn't mean to wake you up, I know the time zones don't work very well down there. Korra. Hi, Daddy, she said, slumping into the seat beside the nightstand. Mako disappeared into the bathroom to give her some privacy. I'm glad you got home safe. What's wrong, sweetheart? What's the matter? I'm probably going to die trying to stop these people and I'm not even sure I deserve to survive. Everything's okay, Dad. We're doing what we can to protect the Fire Lord right now. I just wanted to call and talk for a bit. The shower in the bathroom surged while Korra spoke, providing a heavily edited recount of everything that had happened since leaving the Southern Water Tribe up until returning to Republic City. She tried to leave out the parts with her getting hurt, which only left rather obvious holes in her story. Still, her parents never pressed her for more details. You know, after everything that's happened these past few months, I think I could use a vacation. Of course, honey. Anywhere you want, Senna said. And you can bring your Dad told me you were, seeing the Earth Queen. She couldn't tell if her mother's tone was probing or disapproving. There was too much fatigue on both ends to tell. Yeah, Kuvira and I are together, Mom. I love her, Korra blurted out, throwing her free hand over her mouth as soon as she did. Oh, I see. Senna, let it be. There was some clicking, and her father took the phone. "We just want you to be happy, Korra. Do whatever you need to do, we can't wait to see you again. You and your friends. We'll bring them ice dodging with us." "Of course we will, Dad," Korra lied. "I should go. I love you both so much." Her eyes burned with tears as she hung up the phone. Chapter 35, The Firebending Masters. "You did something new yesterday." Kuvira stopped tracing her thumb over Korra's palm. "What's that?" "You called me the Avatar," she said, shifting closer under the sheets. "When you were talking us up to Izumi. I can't think of another time when you called me that." "Well, you are. I know. It was different, that's all." "Because to me," Kuvira began, shimmying over and closing the distance between them, pressing their bodies together, "Avatar or not, you're Korra first. That's what's important to me, not you bending everything under the sun. I could go and bend platinum, it won't save me. Why couldn't I have met you when things were different?" With a quiet sigh, Korra cupped Kuvira's face in her hands and planted a light kiss on her lips. They both moved against one another, pushing themselves back on the smooth silk sheets of the bed. Korra groaned. "This thing isn't made for two people, it's made for like, 6 or 7. 6, 7. How about 4? Kuvira asked, a wicked little grin tugging at the corners of her mouth. "What?" She sat herself up and glanced toward the door. "You're sure that all hell is going to break loose later today? We might as well have a good morning, right?" Kuvira asked while Korra chewed on her lip. "The last time we did this seemed to go well. I know you still have feelings for Asami and she's still got it bad for you, and Mako's not the worst looking guy by any stretch. Unless you're not into men." "I don't think I ever asked." "No, it's not that, it's just, that's pretty decadent, you know? Even for you. And we're not even drunk this time." Kuvira shifted her way back over to Korra, laying a hand on her bare hip. "I don't do things in half measures, recreation included. And there's still some sake there, we don't have to do anything you don't want, I'm not trying to pressure you. We can keep things between us or just keep cuddling. I thought I'd leave the option open since it sounds like the rest of the day is going to go very badly. Only if you count me dying." Well, if she was going to die, there were worse ways to spend her morning. And she could see that Kuvira was happily mulling the prospect over in her mind. Korra could give her that, and maybe even enjoy it herself, too. Certainly wouldn't improve the princess's opinion of us. "Yeah, why the hell not, I'll go see what they say, I guess." After trying and failing to suppress another grin, Kuvira let Korra roll out of bed, slip on a long blue robe, and peeked out into the hall. No guards in sight, and no one passing by, either. She crept across the floor, and with a little stretching was able to knock on both Mako and Asami's doors at once, giving them each 4 sharp raps. They shambled out after a few moments, Asami cinching her robe, Mako leaning against the door frame in his underwear. "Korra? Is everything okay?" Asami asked, rubbing some sleep out of her eyes. What a loaded question, Korra thought. Mako answered before she could say anything. "No, everything is not okay, because we were sleeping and now we're not. They can't be leaving for this thing now. They're not, this isn't about that. Look, I don't really know how to say this, so I'm just going to say it." She took a deep breath to calm her racing heart, cursed inwardly when it did no good, and looked between both of them. They seemed curious and tired, but ultimately attentive. "Kuvira and I were talking, and we don't know how crazy things are going to get later, so we were wondering if you guys wanted to, you know, come over to our room for a while." Her face burned while the words hung in the air, and she could pinpoint the exact moment when they realized what she was asking. Asami blushed and put a hand over her mouth, while Mako cocked an eyebrow and straightened up off the door frame. "Are you saying what I think you're saying? And you're asking me?" "Mako, please don't be weird about this," Korra said, pinching the bridge of her nose. "Weird? Weird? You're banging on my door at 5 in the morning before the sun is even up, trying to swing a foursome with me, our ex, and the Earth Queen, and I'm being weird? After months of casual physical abuse, after you give me grief for sleeping with Isola, now you're trying to get me into your bed? You've sailed weird right out of the harbor and into the fucking sunset. You slept with the princess? Asami asked. Mako grinned. Korra sighed and crossed her arms. You're right. It was stupid of me to ask, I'm sorry. Go back to sleep. Are you kidding? No chance in hell am I passing this up, he said, cutting her off. Clearly his other head had taken over, Korra thought with a weak smile. Asami. She rubbed the back of her neck, looking from Korra, to Mako, then to the door across the hall. One of her fingers nervously curled a lock of her hair until the traces of a small, wry grin appeared. Sleep can wait. Okay, that was easy, not exactly a hard sell, though. Korra took their hands and led them back to her room, where Kuvira had put on her own robe and was pouring some sake from a crystal decanter into 4 small glasses. She took 2 in each hand, her smirk plain on her face in the low light, and passed them out until only hers remained in her hand. Good morning, she said, her voice calm and measured. Drink. Mako belted it back, shivering as he swallowed. I kind of figured Korra was already drunk if she came to me with this. Oh, don't sell yourself short, Kuvira said in barely more than a whisper, hooking a finger into the neckline of his undershirt. Korra hesitated while the others drank, then followed suit, wincing as the liquid burned its way down her throat. They all sat on the side of the bed, focusing intently on the wall in front of them while one of the wall sconces buzzed. So, Mako said, running his hand through his hair when he finally broke the awkward silence, how'd you 3 jump into this the last time? Kuvira set her glass down on the nightstand and swung herself around so that she was in his lap, arms draped over his shoulders. Like this, she said, nibbling at his lower lip for a moment while Korra and Asami watched, slightly glassy-eyed. Mako's shock wore off rather quickly, and his hands grabbed at her thighs until she stopped and rocked her hips a little. Oh. That's why Korra never dumped you back in jail, isn't it? She didn't have time to defend herself before Asami descended on her, sweeping her up in a deep, desperate kiss as she pushed Korra down onto the bed. Kuvira did the same, shoving Mako onto his back and weaving one hand up with Asami's. Korra could taste the astringent remains of the sake on Asami's lips and her tongue, hands drifting greedily over the thin silk robe and up to Asami's chest, moving in time with the ragged rise and fall of her breathing. She ran her thumb over the fabric covering one stiff nipple, provoking a small, strangled moan that broke Mako and Kuvira out of their reverie. Too many clothes, he said, pawing at the lapels of Kuvira's robe. Mako worked it off her shoulders while she murmured in agreement and pulled his undershirt away. Korra slid one finger under Asami's belt and undid her robe in one deft motion, leaving her to shrug out of it as she tossed her own robe across the room. Mako laughed and slid one finger along the trimmed black hair between Kuvira's legs. Military precision. Why am I not surprised? A pleasant, hazy warmth spread up through Korra's body, complementing the growing ache between her legs that Asami was stoking with her fingers running all over Korra's sides. Kuvira rolled her eyes and kissed her way down Mako's chest, leaving little purple love bites while she worked his underwear off. Korra hissed when she saw him before Kuvira took him in her mouth, botching the whistle she was going for. Is that why you put up with dating him for so long? She asked Asami. You're welcome to find out for yourself, Water Tribe, Mako said, gasping, and letting his head fall back onto the bed sheets, idly threading his fingers through Kuvira's hair. Hey, teeth. Korra paused, trepidation eating at her, and Asami watched them hungrily before turning back to Korra. Do you mind, or? She shook her head and watched Asami shuffle her way down the bed to Kuvira's side, alternating between kissing her and lavishing attention on Mako. His hips bucked, and Korra saw him pinch himself to see if he would wake up before his hand fell over hers. Enjoying the show? Probably not as much as you, Korra said, easing over to lightly kiss him. It was a far cry from kissing Asami or Kuvira, his lips were thinner and his stubble created an unfamiliar texture, but it wasn't bad. Different, she decided. His hand went down to the small of her back, holding her securely against him while she flitted her tongue at his. Even though the room was already warm, almost uncomfortably so with all of them moving about, the heat from his body was pleasant and reassuring in a way she couldn't quite place. A few very weak sparks danced over her skin, running tingles all up and down her spine. Ah. Relax. He swept 2 fingers across her back, inducing tiny spasms in every muscle he touched. It took some getting used to, but soon Cora had her head on his chest, lazily running a few fingers over her clit and watching Kuvira and Asami work him over. The whole room was thick with desire and the sound of rumpling silk while they moved against one another, until Asami rolled away to catch Cora with another kiss as Kuvira climbed onto Mako again. Cora could taste him on her lips, citrusy and bitter with its own sort of muted appeal. "Stay down there. We shouldn't fight about who's on top," Mako said, propping himself up on his elbows while Kuvira eased onto him, taking her time until she hit home and her leg kicked against the mattress. Her toes curled, and the hard muscle over her stomach quivered as she suppressed a gasp before she could regain her composure. "Oh, let's." Asami pulled Cora from them, spooning into her back and cupping one breast while they watched. Every time Mako tried to sit up, Kuvira gave him a quick, playful punch and shoved him back into the pillows around them, keeping up her taunting, languorous rhythm all the while. He tried the same trick as before, running some low-level lightning bending over her abdomen, but all it did was make her pin his hands on either side of his head and kiss him deeply. "You'll blow first," she whispered, biting at his earlobe. "Think so?" His arms wrapped around her and flipped them both in place, mussing up her hair and forcing her back to arch when he thrusted once more. Mako kissed at the side of her neck, leaving small purplish splotches while she made her own marks, raking her nails across his back hard enough to leave several bright red lines. Cora moaned while Asami's hand sped up, made easier by the dampness coating her thighs from watching Mako take her girlfriend. She rocked into the motion, almost wanting to laugh at the sheer libertinage of it all, and tensed up when Asami slipped a finger into her, then a second. Asami curled her hand slightly, scratching an itch she didn't know she had, flaring the heat in her core. Her hips moved with a mind of their own, wordless gasps escaping while desire and arousal threatened to burn her up. "Right there, don't stop, don't." She was vaguely aware of biting down on the bed sheets before closing her eyes for what felt like an instant. It must have been longer. By the time she came to, Kuvira had been flipped around again, her absent grin half hidden in some pillows while Mako was behind her, running sparks over her back with one hand and holding her hair back with the other. "Come on," she said, almost moaning the words into the pillows, working her hips back into his as fast as she could. "Harder, I'm not made of glass, ah." Asami was tracing circles along her hip when they saw Kuvira's whole body shake. No, that was the room shaking, Cora realized. Every bit of metal around them flew out, missing them by some small miracle, and Cora had to wonder how much the palace shifted when Kuvira fell to her side with a look of unqualified bliss on her face. Mako leaned back, twitching from the sudden lack of stimulation. "Looks like I win," he said with a grimace. "That's a very relative statement." "Clearly." Cora sat up, about all she could manage, and eased her way over to him while they all looked curiously at her. She ran a hand up along his chest, weaving around Kuvira's bite marks before winding up at his cheek. "Come here," she said, fighting her racing heart again. Whether it was the sake, emotional exhaustion, or simple animal desire, she couldn't say. Mako raised an eyebrow as she laid back into the pillows, flanked on one side by Asami and Kuvira, running their hands slowly over one another. "Are you sure?" He moved over to her, but didn't press further than a hand drifting up her leg. "I trust you. Just, go slow. I've never done this." "Of course," he said, dipping down so his lips could follow his hand up along her body, kissing right over the scars on her legs. Cora gasped when he reached her clit, still sensitized from Asami's efforts, squirming and running her hands through his hair until he moved on. His stubble tickled at her, a not entirely unwelcome sensation, especially when he got to the delicate skin around her collarbone. By then Cora could feel him stiff against her stomach, making the longing ache in her core come back with a vengeance. Then his lips were on hers, gentle and exploratory, while Asami kissed her neck all over. He wasn't rough, or condescending, or even dispassionate. His needs seemed to melt into her own, and he was only too happy to work at her speed. It was a stark change from the usual Mako, but then, the thought that she would be in such a position with any Mako would have made her laugh only days ago. She worked a hand between their bodies and wrapped it around his shaft, easing back and forth and getting an appreciative groan in response. "Mako? Ready?" he asked, rocking his hips so that he moved along with the lines of her abdominal muscles. Cora nodded, letting her legs spread a little wider. Tell me if anything hurts or if you want me to stop. Why are you being so sweet now? Cora asked, nuzzling into the crook of his shoulder. Must be the sake, he said in between kisses on her cheek. Mako shifted a bit to prod at her, teasing with light pressure that stopped just short of being enough until Cora whined in protest. Or maybe, when you're nice to me, I'm nice to you, and I want you to enjoy this. Her eyes widened when he finally pushed into her, and she pounded her fist on the bed as he hit home, filled up so completely she thought she might break. Hot, ecstatic flames lapped at every inch of her body, bringing on a brief feeling of giddy weightlessness. Everything okay? It feels like you're going to split me in half, Cora gasped out, leaving him stock still. Fuck. I can stop. She bit his lip and clamped her arms around him. Don't. You. Dare. Cora felt her back arching without any input from her as Mako rolled his hips back, leaving her with the sudden desire to grab him and pull him toward her. His arms snaked under her back before pushing in again, providing the same blissful, burning fullness that ached wonderfully through every part of her body. The fear of breaking was still there, she just couldn't care less if she did. Cora's breath came in hot, short gasps while she adjusted to having him inside her, made all the more irregular when she looked over and saw Kuvira down between Asami's legs. This is so fucked. And she was loving it. Still think I don't bend that way, she asked as one of her hands fell away to run through Asami's hair. No no, you've convinced me, Mako said, working them into a much slower rhythm than the one he had with Kuvira. There was no play fighting, no jockeying for position, no freneticism to it. He worked slowly, reading her reactions and moving in concert with her, happy to stay at whatever pace she set. You're so beautiful, Cora. Light little moans and the smells of sweat and sex filled the air around them. A gust of wind flew around the room and broke one of the door hinges when Asami kicked her leg out, frantically sitting up and pulling Kuvira into her lap, desperate to taste her orgasm on the queen's lips before they both fell back onto the bed. One of them nipped at her neck, prompting Cora to turn in time to get another kiss from Asami while Kuvira tousled Mako's hair. Is he treating you well? Asami asked, her voice low and shaky. Cora worked her arm under Asami to wrap them all in a tight hug, rolling her hips so that Mako hit the spot that felt like scratching the most satisfying itch she ever had. Everyone was on her, kissing her, touching her, reveling in the pure pleasure and hedonism of it all without a thought for the world beyond their bed. It was getting hard to tell where she ended and they began in their soft, warm tangle. It was getting hard to focus on anything beyond the rapidly mounting pressure in her abdomen, and the stone floor beneath them shifted as the motion and kisses worked it to a fever pitch. Mako, I'm faster. It was all she could get out in her haze, but he understood well enough. His pace picked up, making the pressure flare and crowd out anything else, and someone's hand worked skillfully at her clit all the while. She couldn't tell whose. She didn't much care. All she cared about were the jolts of pleasure arcing almost painfully through her, the way her head swam when she took Mako up to the hilt. She screamed, the remaining sake on the far table freezing and shattering its decanter as her orgasm ripped through her body. White light briefly clouded her vision before she could get a hold of herself, and the arch in her back fell out, collapsing along with the rest of her body while she came down. Kuvira drew her hand away and laid her fingers over Cora's lips so she could taste herself, sweet and salty with a slightly bitter tinge. Mako, don't, not inside, Cora mumbled. His face dropped into the pillow beside her head and his motion stilled in an instant while the silk around his tightening fist rumpled. You really have to tell me these things beforehand. A pang of fear struck her. Are you going to? No, just don't move, he said, his panting breaths warm on Cora's neck. She lightly kissed his cheek in apology, only to make him groan and shudder. Not helping. He pulled away after a few moments, curling up as if in prostration while Asami rubbed his back and Cora adjusted to the sudden, gnawing lack of fullness in her body. It left another sweet kind of ache in her core, one that she found subsided fairly quickly if she refused to indulge it again. Both of them could only manage quick, uneven breaths for several minutes while they recovered. Poor thing, Asami said, leaning down to wrap Mako in a hug. Easy, I can't pump the brakes a third time. Nonetheless, he sat up and linked his hands around her waist. Asami shifted herself until she was in his lap, making him wince every time she brushed against his shaft. So don't. Korra didn't see Asami work her way onto him before Kuvira eased her into a sitting position, resting Korra's back against her chest and keeping her in a loose hug. You made such cute faces with him, Kuvira whispered in her ear as they watched Mako and Asami having fun. She nodded breathlessly, watching Asami dig her nails into Mako's shoulders. They weren't fighting to see who got to be on top or working toward their own gratification, Korra saw. It ran much deeper than that. The way Mako's hands expertly touched along the tiny freckles on Asami's back, or how she plunged them into a deep kiss that persisted across their slow rhythm, it wasn't simple lust and self-indulgence for them. They were old lovers falling back into their familiar habits, with memories mixed in among new sensations. A tiny voyeuristic thrill crept through Korra as she and Kuvira watched their love-making. One of her hands drifted back along Kuvira's leg, finding its way down the taut muscle of her stomach and through the trimmed little patch of hair before settling over her clit, making Kuvira gently bite her shoulder in response. Her own body was still too oversensitized, but Kuvira was more than accommodating, hips shifting back to provide a better angle. She was still awash in her own arousal, making Korra's small circular motions a simple matter until Asami broke their kiss to look over at them. Look, we have an audience, are you two just going to sit there and watch? The challenge in her tone spurred them both on, shifting over until they were flanking their friends. Korra gently kissed up and down Asami's throat, Kuvira flitted her tongue over one of Asami's stiff pink nipples, and Korra quickly lost track of whose hands were where and doing what. At one point they were all wrapped up in a single complex, messy kiss, then another, and then Korra and Kuvira fell back onto the bed, panting and recovering while they enjoyed the rest of the show. Asami. She didn't need for him to finish his thought. Her pace quickened, her hips rocking back and forth on his until short, sharp tremors racked both of them. Mako kissed her hard, sparks flying haphazardly from his body and making the nearest wall sconce blow out from the discharge. Neither of them made any motion to separate for several minutes, instead staying right up against one another in a tight embrace until exhaustion took its toll and made them fall over beside Korra. She worked one arm under both of them and brought the other under Kuvira on her other side to pull them all into a tight cuddle. I love you, she said in barely more than a murmur, unable to articulate any further. I love you, I love you. We love you too, Korra. In her haze, she couldn't quite tell who responded. It didn't matter. She knew it was true. Any thoughts that threatened to crop up about the rest of the day and what it meant for her were quickly quashed. It wasn't the time. I think the room's a lost cause, Kuvira said, looking over her shoulder at the mess they had made. We should shower, though. They were a panting, tangled mess of sweat and cum and arousal, hardly presentable for the Fire Lord. Still, Korra shook her head and tightened her grip. Everything outside of their bed meant fighting and destruction and dying. Soon. Thank you for joining us. Isola didn't look up from the long table in the middle of her office, covered almost entirely with maps and dossiers that several intelligence officers were scurrying to organize. Along the back wall was another map that highlighted the route to the demonstration grounds and the various roadblocks set up to keep it clear. Korra wondered if there had been a similar corps of people working to keep the Earth Kingdom royal family safe. If there was, they hadn't arrived a day too soon. She finally did spare a smirking glance for Mako, who could only meet it with simple serene contentment. This is why we're here, Kuvira said, her crown once again in a simple armband. Do we have a timetable and a convoy set up? 4 cars in the western garage are set to go. The Capitol Police have Machibu's street closed off for us, that part won't be a problem. My mother's airship will also be making a very visible approach over the city, but she'll be in the 3rd car with you 4. Hanako and I will be in the car behind you, she said, putting small markers on the map in front of her on the table. You're not going with the Fire Lord? Korra asked. I'm the Crown Princess. We aren't allowed to travel together. My little sister isn't a bender, so she needs the protection. Isola tossed that map out of the way and pulled another toward her, one that showed the topography of the area west of Kasai. And this is what I'm most concerned about, anyway. The demonstration grounds. A large open amphitheater with lots of crude seating and too many sight lines to cover. It's here, at the base of the Oweri volcano. We have a platinum-lined booth carved out here, but a good portion of the front is still open. More than enough for a combustion bender to take advantage of, or so my grandfather tells me. Asami's fingers traced over the contour lines on the map that indicated a steep rise in elevation immediately west of the arena. Your capital is right beside an active volcano. And Republic City is built on a fault line, Isola countered. We all roll the dice one way or another. I'm not worried around the volcano, the worst it ever does is smoke up a bit. If it were up to me, my mother would make a very nice radio address from the palace about the confluence of holidays, not a public appearance at a place we can't even hope to secure. Under the frustration in her voice, Cora could pick out a great deal of fear contributing to the uneasy calm in the room. We won't let anything happen to her, she said. I promise. I'll feel much better when we're bickering at the dinner table tonight, Cora. But thank you. It's almost time. A very red-faced guard slipped into the room and wordlessly handed a note to Isola. She gave it a quick read, and a vein appeared in her forehead before she burned the paper in her hands. She was awfully fond of doing that, Cora thought. Your Majesty. Kuvira looked up from the section of the map she was studying with Mako. Yes. I'm going to need the address in Zaofa where your Treasury Department set up shop. Okay, may I ask why? So I can bill the Earth Kingdom for the damage to your room, she said dryly, making them all squirm. And although I would really rather not know exactly what made one of you tilt the entire guest wing by 15 degrees, we do need it put back. When a thoroughly embarrassed Cora and Kuvira had corrected the tilt of the guest wing and donned their armor, they rejoined Mako and Asami in the garage, clad in some nondescript armor of their own from the intelligence service. Izumi hugged both of her daughters, put them in the fourth car in the line, and went to the identical one right in front of it. Cora. Kuvira. My guest quarters are back in their proper damaged place, I trust. For a woman with such a severe resting expression, she enjoyed her fair share of teasing. The blush showed up much more noticeably on Kuvira's cheeks while they climbed into the back of the car. In our defense, those scorch marks on the ceiling were already there, Mako said, opening his mouth before really thinking about what he was saying. Asami buried her face in her hands, Kuvira stared at him in shock, and Cora had to sit on her hands to keep from reaching over and strangling him. Oh, wait. Izumi raised an eyebrow as the car left the garage, bathing them in light through the heavily tinted windows. Mako looked pointedly at the floor of the car, rubbing the back of his neck and avoiding Cora's glare. Yes. Well. As interesting as I'm sure it would be to ask after that, what you four do on your own time is your business, Izumi said, fiddling with one of the arms of her glasses. Although I do have to ask that you at least try to refrain from damaging anything else. The palace is full of antiques. Not much fear of that if we never make it back, Cora thought glumly. It won't happen again, Kuvira said. Much as Isola predicted, the ride to the demonstration grounds was uneventful, spent in tense, expectant silence. Police on motorbikes escorted them most of the way, peeling off when they crossed the city limits only to be replaced by two heavily armored trucks that kept pace with them until they reached the covered path that led to their booth. Cora got her first good look at Princess Hanako while they walked the final stretch of the way, another rail-thin girl with sharp features, black hair in a top knot, and a simple red suit. Apart from being slightly shorter and maybe half Isola's age, she looked remarkably like her sister, who stayed protectively in front of her while they walked. If they were focused on one another, Cora thought, she could concentrate on Izumi and keep an eye out for combustion blasts. If she could even see them in the first place. Tapping her heel on the floor of the booth, Cora could feel the platinum in the walls, floor, and ceiling, a thin layer that wouldn't provide much shielding. For all its resilience to metal bending, platinum was frighteningly brittle and vulnerable to concussive blasts, as Peely had been only too happy to show her years prior when they believed Cora could still learn combustion bending. It wasn't a shield. It was a cage. Their arrival went largely unnoticed, a quirk of Isola's planning that Cora was grateful for. Below them on the amphitheater stage, the demonstration had already begun with a pair of firebenders, no doubt enhanced by the volcano nearby. They arced around each other, spinning rings of flame within smaller rings in a dizzying dance. Cora had only a few moments to reflect on the morbidity of such a performance on an air nomad holiday before the little hairs on the back of her neck stood up. TCK TCK TCK. Down, she screamed, throwing herself over Izumi. The earth and platinum around them sheared apart like wet paper, raining down in hard, painful chunks. A piece of the ceiling hit Korra in the head as she got to her feet, pulling Izumi up with her arm over Korra's shoulder. The left wall and most of the ceiling were gone, providing an open sight line into the adjacent stands where the spectators were all scrambling to leave. Peely was plainly visible, motionless amongst the chaos. A sliver of platinum had torn across her cheek and she had been knocked unconscious from hitting her head on the floor, but otherwise the Fire Lord seemed unharmed. Korra passed her over to Isola in between barked orders and fits of coughing. "Go, get her out of here," Korra said before turning to Kuvira and Asami. Both of them seemed fairly shaken up, but still in one piece. "You need to leave, too. We'll help evacuate them, but we're not leaving you here." Kuvira bent away some of the debris obstructing the path back to the road. "Your targets," Korra said, pleading with them. "Please, you can't fight this woman, I can't have you getting yourselves killed." Mako came running back from carrying Hanako to the cars. "The airship came down, the whole road is blocked. Really need a metal bender right about now." Kuvira wavered in place, finally leaning into a quick, fierce kiss. "I'll be back," she said, hurrying down to the road. "You too, Asami. I'm not going to have any more airbenders die." She bit her lip and settled for a quick hug before going to help with the evacuations. Only Mako was left, quickly cauterizing a cut on his wrist. Korra peeked over the remains of one wall and saw Peely advancing on them, calmly stepping over the debris left in the panic, braid billowing behind her. "I can't ask you to help me with this, Mako." Some sparks crackled at his fingertips. "I've got your back, Water Tribe." Korra raised a thick earthen wall from the stands when she heard another TCK coming toward them. It rattled terribly, but held together long enough for them to run out the back of the booth. The air sizzled as a bolt of lightning came bearing down on them, scorching through the air until Mako caught it and sent it harmlessly into the sky. "Stop this!" Korra yelled, ripping up random segments of the stands to trip her up, though it ultimately did no good. Every time Korra threw another obstacle into her path, fire burst from her feet and propelled her effortlessly over or around it, all the while keeping Korra and Mako running to avoid explosions. They got a moment's reprieve when she twisted the ground under Peely's feet, turning her completely around, letting them recover long enough for Mako to throw back some lightning of his own. One fork of it hit home, striking her elbow and traveling up, before dispersing harmlessly into her body. Mako's eyes widened for the instant before he had to dive behind some of the ruined seating. Another blast with a severe curve tore through the air, missing him by inches before demolishing the row of seats behind him. She knew she had only one chance while Mako drew fire for her. Korra rooted herself on what was left of the ground, muttered an apology about damaging more antiques, and snapped her fists shut. The entire amphitheater rumbled, and she knew she was walking a razor's edge with the volcano so close by. White light flashed in her eyes, and cracks as thick as her arms snaked outward in a crude circle around Peely, who only realized what was happening as it happened. She threw her arms straight up over her head, white-hot flames pluming from her hands to keep the ground in place. Mako was little more than a blur out of the corner of Korra's eye as he rocketed forward, twisting his body around in time to kick Peely hard in the chest. They both disappeared in the ensuing blaze, leaving Korra free to throw part of the amphitheater stands. Even so, it fell back into place when the inferno crashed and scorched its way down to the stage, saving her the effort. "Why do you pick now to be a hero?" Korra pulled in the air around her feet and leapt above the stage, windmilling her arms to keep steady before coming right down on the fire. Another blast of air forced open a small landing point where she fell, and a wave of heat struck her as she hit the ground. Flames licked at her armor until she could snuff them out. She could feel a sharp sting on her neck where an ember landed. By the time she dispelled the fire, Mako had lost his scuffle, feet kicking out uselessly while Peely, bright red blood streaming from her nose and mouth, held him up by his throat. "Mako! Light chakra!" He wound his fist back, but a knee flew into his gut before he could land a hit. Mako struck the ground with fresh scald marks on his neck and went rolling across the stage, propelled by nothing more than the sheer physicality of her toss. Korra drove hard to draw her attention, striking her with all the water she had and turning the ground at her feet to lava. It wasn't nearly enough. The water sizzled and evaporated, and she simply jumped away to avoid the churning, melted stone. She's not human, Mako gasped out, coughing up a thick glob of blood as he stood. She can't be. TCK TCK TCK. There was no way for Korra to pull up a barrier fast enough. She could hear herself crying out, even if she didn't remember doing it. Mako threw his hand out, fingertips erupting with sparks and wide forks of bright blue lightning. It arced out to meet the thin little disturbance in the air, detonating the blast in the space between them. All three of them paused, unsure of what to make of it, until Korra bent a few pebbles and launched them scattershot at Peely's head. She didn't wait to see if it worked. A few strips of metal sheared away from the pads on her legs, coalescing into 3 thicker strips as they raced toward the combustion bender. One strip caught and bound her wrists together, the second got her ankles, and the third clamped tight around her forehead, digging in so that it could fuse securely at the back of her head. She reeled back, thrashing in an attempt to get her hands free, but not before Korra could run up and send a flurry of punches into her fire chakra. At least one rib fractured with a sickening crack when she went off target. Peely sank to her knees, still trying to get her hands free when Korra took several steps back. Her knuckles were singed, even after nothing more than quick, simple strikes through padded armor. "What are we doing with her?" Mako asked, gingerly touching the red marks on his neck. Korra was silent for a moment as she watched Peely fall still, wisps of smoke appearing from her bloodied nose while she fumed. "Find out where Zahir is, then kill her. I don't care what Izumi wants." Mako's brow furrowed up. "Korra." "Yeah. How long does the light chakra stay blocked for?" A bolt of lightning might as well have struck her. They both turned back toward Peely, who spared Korra one last look before closing her eyes with a calm, resigned expression. "No." All she could hear was a sharp, pervasive ringing. Dust and hot, wet blood covered her in equal measure. Large sections of her armor were simply gone, and what remained was shredded nearly to uselessness from the overpressure. Korra coughed up a mouthful of dirt, earning a quick stab of pain in her chest for her trouble. She rolled onto her back, sat up, and got a good look at what was left of the amphitheater, or what parts of it she could see in the dust cloud that hung in the air. There was nothing but a black mark on the ground where Peely had been. Korra pulled off the remains of her armor, leaving her torn-up clothing exposed. "Mako." "Here," came his weak reply. She followed his voice over to where he had landed, almost gagging when she saw him. He was also soaked with blood, and arms were not supposed to bend that way. He must have noticed her grimace. "How bad is it?" "That needs to be set as soon as can be." "It'll hurt." "It hurts now," he countered, sitting up and looking away while unbuckling his armor. Korra tore off a piece of her shirt for him to bite down on, braced his arm against the side of his thigh, and reached under his leg so she could grab his wrist. 1, 2. Tears formed in his eyes as she yanked his forearm back into place. His other hand beat at the ground until Korra held him against her and let him whimper into her shoulder. "They're over here." Several blasts of air began dispelling the dust cloud around them. Asami and Kuvira ran up, both cringing while Korra helped Mako to his feet. "Korra, you're covered in blood," Kuvira said, holding one hand over her mouth. "Both of you." She bent it all away. "It's not ours." "What happened with Izumi?" "We got the road cleared and everyone evacuated," Asami said. "Isola took her and her sister to the hospital. Might be a concussion at worst." "What about Peely?" "Tried to take us with her." "Korra." Her hackles shot straight up, and they all turned to the source of the voice in the next section of the amphitheater stands. "Zahir," she said through a snarl. "You dropped this." All she could see was the glint of the knife soaring toward her before being shoved down and out of harm's way. Chapter 36, Endgame. Mako, to his credit, managed to stay standing for several more seconds before sinking to the ground with Korra's old knife lodged below his collarbone. Fresh blood began running down his shirt, and though he tried to speak, no words came out when he opened his mouth. Asami darted to the ground to keep him sitting up and keep the wound above his heart while Kuvira pulled Korra back to her feet. Zahir was gone, she saw. "Much worse than the arm," he finally said through pained gasps. His good hand came up to where the blade had lodged in him, but Kuvira pushed it away as her soldier training took over. Don't. It needs to stay in until we can get you to the hospital. Asami, stand back. There should still be ambulances near the road. She bent the amphitheater ground into a crude inclined stretcher. Korra wiped a few tears from her eyes. Why, after I've been so awful to you? I told you. Mako grimaced as he got his injured arm settled over his stomach. I've got your back, Water Tribe. He started going for the top of the volcano. Don't lose him. Korra nodded. What are you going to do? Kuvira asked. End this. Once and for all. By yourself? Let us help you. You can't help me anymore. She kissed Kuvira, quickly, roughly. I need to do this now. Alone. If I don't come back, destroy all the paths up to the summit, she said, her voice resolute. Korra, you're going to come back, you understand? That's an order. Sorry, Your Majesty. I don't believe in queens. Go. Kuvira bent the stretcher into the air and hurried off with Mako and Asami, leaving Korra alone in the ruins of the amphitheater. She knelt down and ran her fingers over a few drops of his blood, smearing it into her palm while she began to shake. A few cracks in the ground near her split wider, and the dust-choked air kicked into a furious swirl. Bright white flames burst from Korra's feet before she had even jumped, scorching the earth beneath her while her bounding leap took her to the western edge of the stands. White light threatened in her periphery, but she tamped it down. She was going to end this as herself. And if she died as herself, at least the cycle would continue. There was a path leading up the side of the Oweri volcano, carved into the stone and winding back on itself several times. Zahir was nowhere she could see, and so she ignored the path, ripping handholds out of the stone in between bouts, propelling herself upward with fire bending. Everything ached, one of her ribs felt like it was cracked, and dozens of voices rang through her head. Korra begged them for an hour of silence, but she still felt them there, simmering under the surface. Whichever one of you is saying I don't have to kill him, save your breath. Her fingertips were raw and bloody from climbing when she finally reached the mountaintop. The tie holding her hair in place had fallen out, leaving it matted amongst the sweat around her face. Korra fought through the wave of heat breaking over her and pulled down part of the footpath, making it impassable. No going back, then. A small tunnel brought her deeper into the interior of the volcano. Little outlines petals burned into the walls told her she was in the right place, and she periodically collapsed the path behind her to destroy any chance of escape. The heat got worse as she continued, as did the low rumble of the magma far beneath them. Every step felt like another foot into hell. Korra emerged on the edge of the volcano, a large flat area that overlooked a churning pool of lava below. Hazard Redoubt, she remembered from the maps. The air shimmered from the heat, through which she saw no one. Zahir, she said, her voice raw and ragged. She couldn't lose him, not now, she couldn't give him the opportunity to get away again. Zahir. Her leg gave out when a rush of air hit the back of her knee, forcing her down in time to catch a sudden kick to the nape of the neck. Korra's cheek scraped against the ground, and she lashed out toward the hand grabbing her shoulder. Fire burst from her swinging fist, but Zahir leapt back farther than she would have guessed possible. It wasn't possible, she realized. Not for a non-bender. You were there, Korra said, getting back to her feet while he advanced on her. Some fresh blood trickled down her cheek. At the air temple. How observant of you. She threw her hands up to withstand the brunt of another air blast, but it broke through her guard. Any attempt to rip up the ground at his feet only met with him jumping clear, and she knew fighting at range wasn't going to work. Getting in close and figuring out how to block the sound chakra was all she could do. Korra dipped into the avatar state, more than she would have liked, but she needed the boost. Everything grew more vivid, right down to the minuscule bits of dirt on Zahir's tunic. Her pain dulled, and the deep breaths she couldn't take because of her rib returned. He stopped mid-step, and it was her turn to advance. You have no one left, Korra said, her voice booming around the volcano. Lightning crackled from her fists and grounded out near her feet. All your friends are dead, and now it's your turn. Bright red lines snaked out from beneath her boots. Zahir sidestepped them easily enough, twisting through the air and giving as good as he got. He met every shard of earth or fire blast with a rush of air, deflecting them or shooting them down entirely. Korra snarled, delving further and further into the Avatar state, throwing larger, fiercer attacks that made the volcano beneath them shudder with instability. It was only when she was completely off the ground, propelled by nothing more than her own airbending, that she realized she had fallen completely into the Avatar state. She shook her head clear, dropping back down and wincing as all her pain returned. Zahir saw his chance and took it. A ball of air landed squarely in her gut, knocking the wind out of her and putting her on her back. Korra clawed at her throat, trying to force air down into her lungs while Zahir took the knife in her boot Asami had given her. He twirled it in his hand, idly testing the balance in full view of her. It wasn't a threat so much as a taunt, lording himself over her. "All my friends?" Zahir asked, kneeling down with his leg over her chest. He ran the flat of the knife over her throat. The cold steel pressed into her skin made her squirm. "I doubt that, unless you've been very busy. The roots of the Red Lotus run deeper than you know." Korra swung her hand to slap the knife away, but he grabbed her fingers and bent one back until she was screaming in pain, trying to writhe out from under him. "I know all of your friends, though." The tip of the knife turned in place and pressed into her neck. "I'll give them your regards." Prepared as she was to die, hearing him threaten her friends made something snap inside of Korra. She took hold of the metal in her knife, wrenching it out of his grip and sinking it deep below his collarbone, at the same place he had hit Mako. Blood gushed down onto her face as the knife twisted around in his shoulder, resisting every attempt he made to yank it out. She hardened the loose blood on her skin into a small disc and used it to hammer the knife deeper into him. Zahir staggered back while the tip of the knife poked through the other side of his tunic. "You aren't going to hurt them," Korra growled, getting herself up with a handspring. Rage piled on and buried all the pain from pushing her body to its absolute limit. "You aren't going to hurt anyone." The earth around one of his feet shot up, clamping tight before twisting quickly. His ankle gave out a short, sharp crack, but Korra didn't wait to hear his gasp of pain. Countless sharpened stones battered him, and though his blasts of air could repel a good number of them, he couldn't stop them all. Dozens of tiny rips appeared all over his clothes and ran red when the stones burrowed deep into his skin. "Korra!" Another stone cracked him across the jaw, leaving a massive splotch swelling all over his face. "I don't want to hear your begging." She took her time cuffing his hands securely behind his back, tightening the stone so much his wrists were ready to break. His legs got the same treatment, damaging his ankle further when he fell over. Korra grabbed him by the neck, giving herself over to the glow in her eyes, and dragged him to the edge of the volcano, where sweltering heat hit her in a long, continuous wave. Her body was ready to give out, but she didn't care. Korra bent the knife away, twisting it on its way out of him, intent on paying back some small fraction of the pain he had caused her for 20 years. It clattered nearby while she kept at him, punching and punching and punching, hitting the ground as often as she struck him. Hot, wet tears burned their way down her cheeks, and by the time she stopped screaming Korra realized that she was holding him by his neck over the volcano, staring into cold gray eyes surrounded by the bruised and bloody remains of his face. Her arms trembled from the effort, but she was aware of it more than she actually felt it. Korra ground her teeth while they looked at one another, the Avatar and the Anarchist, him utterly at her mercy. She could have laughed if her throat weren't so raw. The urge to let go was so strong as to be almost overwhelming, but something kept her hands tight. "You can't do it," Zahir said, his voice thick with blood and a broken jaw. "Nothing else we taught you sank in. Why would a killer instinct? All the power in the world and nothing to do with it. Because you know that once I'm gone, all you'll find of the Red Lotus will be staring you in the mirror." Each breath came heavy and painful while his words rang mockingly in her head. "The Avatar shouldn't be a murderer. All you are is a failure. Do you feel like a hero yet, Avatar? You're as much a part of the Red Lotus as we are." No, the Avatar forgives you," she said, letting the light fade from her eyes so she could look at him as herself. As the little girl he lied to and brutalized and robbed of a childhood. As Korra. But I don't. Lightning coursed from her fingertips and into his neck, crackling so hot and for so long that the skin beneath her hands charred and blackened. It fed back into her, running such pain up her arms she thought her bones might splinter, but it was so paltry compared to the rest of the trauma her body and her mind had been through. She broke and shattered along with him, sparks jumping to her fresh tears, until her fire chakra gave out from overexertion. And then she let go. She made sure to watch his body hit the lava and disappear beneath the bright, molten rock. It wasn't the time to take chances. He barely made a hiss over the churning and rumbling. Cora sank to her knees, sobbing and laughing all at once while the pain returned in full force. It could have seared unceasingly through her body, for all she cared. It was over. Almost. It might have been minutes or hours before they found her. She couldn't say. All Cora knew was that she felt all her barriers in the tunnel behind her being stripped away by another earthbender. Up here, she heard Kuvira say. Over the rumbling of the volcano there were several sets of rushed footsteps. Cora stayed sitting, facing away from them, looking down at the lava until her eyes hurt. She wiped some of the blood from her face. Cora? Are you okay? She felt like she had gone head-to-head with a freight train, but that didn't matter. Fine. How's Izumi? Getting an earful from Isola, Asami said. Did you, I mean? He's dead. I saw him hit the lava. Cora glanced over her shoulder and saw Mako there too, a large bandage hastily patched over his shoulder. All of them were there, then. Cora winced. She hadn't wanted an audience. And then there will only be one member left. You. And they will turn on you, just like you turned on us. Fall on your sword and save them the trouble. Kuvira breathed a sigh of relief. It's a good thing you guessed right about them being here, Cora. I didn't guess. I knew. I know how they think. Because I'm one of them. Well, they're all dead, Asami said. It's over. Almost. Please forgive me. She stood up, clutching at a cracked rib, and took a step toward the edge. Their gazes burned into her back. Cora? Kuvira asked. Cora, what are you doing? Please don't make this harder, she said, choking back more tears. Just go. Make sure no one ruins the next avatar. Cora closed her eyes, shut out all the myriad voices calling out to her in her mind, and leaned forward, over the edge. Metal coils shot out and wrapped around her waist, holding her there, trying to draw her back in. She hadn't wanted them there with her, she knew they wouldn't understand. Cora broke Kuvira's grasp on the wires and cut them neatly in two, falling again only to have Mako grab her. A massive plume of fire burst from his free, outstretched hand, pushing them back over solid ground where they fell into a cushion of air. She tried to twist out of his grasp, but she was at her limit. Cutting away the wires had taken the last bit of strength she had. You hit your head or something? Mako asked, still holding her there while he sat them both up. What's the matter with you? Let me go, she pleaded, unable to hold back the tears any longer. They rolled along her cheeks, mixing with the dirt and dust there. Let me go. Asami descended on her other side and Kuvira grabbed her from the front, pinning Cora by sitting in her lap. Not a chance. You don't understand, none of you understand. No one ruined you, Cora, Asami said, her face buried in Cora's shoulder. Not any more than the Equalists ruined me or the Triads ruined Mako. We changed, and you did, too. Kuvira hugged her tighter while sharp, painful sobs started racking their way through her body. You're not one of them. You've been around me for months. You came here to save the Fire Lord. There's nothing of them in you anymore, she said, lightly running her hand through Cora's hair. No Red Lotus, just Cora. We love you, and we're not going to let you destroy yourself. They all closed in around her. For how long, Cora couldn't say. Eventually she stopped crying and lost the will to struggle against them. There wasn't a need anymore. She was at her lowest point, fallen, broken Cora, covered in scars and cuts and blood, and they still loved her. Her arms were pinned to her sides, and instead of hugging them she relaxed into the embrace. The last petal of the Red Lotus burned away in her mind. I love you, too. Everything okay now? Mako asked. Cora nodded as best she could. Yeah, she said softly. They backed up cautiously, ready to grab her again if they needed to, but she only took Kuvira's hand and started them all back the way they came. Yeah, I'm okay. Epilogue. 10 years later. Avatar Korra? Or is it Chief Korra? You're collecting titles too fast for people to keep up. She grinned and turned to the source of the voice. A tall, striking woman with a shock of lustrous back hair was standing behind her, adorned in all the saffron and maroon finery of the Air Nation. Pale blue arrows lined her arms, and one broke through her hairline and terminated on her forehead. Her smile was also just as big as Korra's. You're one to talk, Madam President, Korra countered, pulling her into a tight hug. Despite being in loose, sleeveless robes at the South Pole, she was remarkably warm. It's so good to see you, Asami. It's been too long. Almost 3 years now. Asami made no motion to pull away, instead rubbing slow, rhythmic circles into Korra's back through her tunic. Do I have to get another set of tattoos so you'll visit again? It couldn't hurt, you know I love the ink, Korra said, tapping lightly on the blue line that ran along the back of her neck. They finally did separate, after one last strong squeeze. Where'd Hiroshi get to? Asami glanced around, looking by her feet and then in her immediate vicinity. I don't know, he was right Hiroshi, get down from there. The boy who was trying to get a handhold on an ice sculpture nearby hung his head and jumped down, cushioning his fall with a pocket of swirling air before running over to them, weaving around seats and tables the whole way. I told you not to climb on anything, Asami said while he bumped into her leg. Sorry, Mom. Hi, Aunt Korra. She knelt down and wrapped him in a brief hug. Hey, kiddo, haven't seen you in a while. You're getting pretty tall, how old are you now? 20, 25. 10, he said proudly, holding up all his fingers. Wow, you know, even I couldn't airbend when I was 10, Korra told him in a hushed, conspiratorial tone. So, in a way, it's like you're better than the Avatar. His bright amber eyes lit up. Really? Korra, you'll give him a swelled head. Why don't you go get Dad, honey? Asami asked, patting him on the back. Tell him I found the Avatar. I think he's with Kanek and Naoki, he said, running off. Asami turned back to Korra, who shuddered. What is it? Kanek's creepy, Korra said. I don't care if he is my cousin or the crown prince or whatever, he's 16 and he's already weirder than Eska. Why can't he be fun like your and Jinora's kids? Asami shrugged. They didn't grow up in an ice palace. She fixed one of the fastenings on her robe, and her expression rose slightly. So how's your dad enjoying retirement? He's loving it, why wouldn't he? Korra rolled her eyes. He stuck me with the hard job. I can't wait until they swear in the new chief next month, let him deal with the legislature, plus we have leads on a few more Red Lotus cells that I don't want to go cold. Really? How'd you get those? I still have some friends in the intelligence service. They both turned to the woman in the dark green gown who had come along without their noticing. Kuvira planted a light kiss on Korra's cheek before wrapping Asami in a hug. Congratulations on your re-election, Asami. Thank you, Your Highness. She leaned back and shook her head. Oh, I abdicated, you know that. All those titles start to wear on you after a while. It's just Kuvira again. Su hasn't gotten you to take the Prime Minister job back yet? Asami asked. Not for lack of trying. She calls every week, just to check up. Not one conversation goes by without her very nicely suggesting I run in the next election. But I'm happy being a private citizen again, and I'll be even happier when we move back to Zaofu. Korra nudged her arm. What, you don't like it here? It's beautiful. I like having more than one season. I'm strange like that. There are still Red Lotus cells? Asami asked. Kuvira's expression fell, and she quickly glanced around before answering. Some. They're damn persistent. It's not as bad as it was 8 years ago, but lots of people weren't happy when we started pushing for more democracy. They don't coordinate with each other, and they aren't full of freakishly powerful benders, but it's like trying to weed a garden the size of the whole world. We might never be finished. Finished with what? Mako was doing his best to walk over to them, trying to keep Hiroshi from climbing up his side with one arm while holding a young girl in the other as she shied away from the company. He was giving the beard another valiant try, Korra saw. A tall water tribe boy with an immensely disinterested look followed behind him and gave Korra a small wave. "And Korra. Happy birthday," he said in his usual flat tone. "Thanks, Kanak. Ow hey. I said you could climb Dad Mountain later." Mako managed to get Hiroshi by the collar and passed him off to his brother. Kanak minded much less when Hiroshi started trying to scale him, too, staying motionless beside their father. "And we lost Jinora, damn it." "No, I'm here. And don't swear around Naoki." Her gait was somewhat impeded by her obviously pregnant frame, but she caught up after a moment. Korra noted with some petty disappointment that even Jinora was taller than her now and shook her head. "Mako, there's a wonderful new invention called the condom, have you heard of it?" "Oh, Kinnet, Water Tribe." Mako set Naoki down so he could put an arm around Jinora, as much for support as intimacy. "It's not like I'm the only one to blame here." "Yes, you are. You did this to me again," Jinora said, squeezing his arm until he bent down and kissed her on the cheek. "Naoki, show everybody what you can do." She looked nervously up at her mother, then at Korra, Kuvira, and Asami. Korra knelt down and gave her a wide, beaming smile. "It's okay, honey." Naoki screwed up her face in concentration, brought her small hands in a quick circle in front of her, and blew Korra's hair back with a huge rush of air. Korra blinked a few times, her eyes watering, while Naoki jumped excitedly up and down. Kuvira smiled and tousled the girl's hair. "Nice shot. I wish I could do that sometimes." Yeah, wait till we're alone, that's really great, Naoki," Korra said, slowly fixing her hair as she stood up. She beamed while Mako swept her up in his arms and rubbed their noses together, much to her delight. "Mako, I'm curious, how long has it been since you've had a full night's sleep?" He shrugged and winced as Hiroshi jumped from Kanek's shoulders to his. "You know, I'd tell you, but the sleep deprivation makes it hard to remember things." "You love it," Jinora said, leaning on his side. His younger children nuzzled into him, and even Kanek gave him a stiff, awkward hug. A tiny smile tugged at the sides of his mouth. "Yeah." One of Korra's staffers appeared at her side and handed her a small slip of paper. She looked it over, pursed her lips and torched it right then and there. "What's the matter?" Asami asked. "More Red Lotus in my backyard," she said, tying her hair back. "Having us all here at once must have been too tempting. Kuvira and I will be right back, can you cover for us?" Mako looked askance at her. "This is your birthday party, how are we supposed to explain you not being here? And do you really think we'd let you two have all the fun with the party crashers?" He handed Naoki off to her mother and wrangled Hiroshi from the side of his head. "Jinora, do you mind?" Asami asked. "It's all right," she said, balancing one kid in each arm. "You four go save the day, I don't think I could do much more than be pregnant at them. Just be careful, honey. Come on kids, let's go find somewhere to sit down." She and Kanek went off toward the tables while Kuvira reformed her elaborate metal necklace into a pair of gauntlets. Mako loosened the top button of his jacket, and they started for the door. "You're going to fight in those gowns?" he asked, nodding to their dresses. "Good luck." "I'm the Avatar," Korra said, leading the way. A small grin tugged at her lips. "Just like old times. We don't need luck. Check the description for the links to the author."